Snow whipped sideways across the high ridge like white arrows. The western sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, with no warning at all. In the open corral at the mouth of the valley, a black horse reared, ears pinned flat, eyes rolling white. The lead rope still looped around the woman's wrist. She hit the frozen ground hard. The wind screamed. A section of the lean-to-roof tore free with a crack like a rifle shot. Who would step between 1,100 pounds of panicked horse and the person lying beneath it? A figure was already over the fence. Boots slipped on ice. Hands closed on the taut rope. A low, steady voice cut through the storm. Easy, easy now. Forelegs cut the air inches from his face. The rope jerked hard, nearly tearing free. The man held on, never looking back. Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory, 1882. The trap line ran 11 miles that winter. 11 miles of frozen creek beds. Black spruce standing like sentries in the gray half-light. Silence so complete a man could hear his own heartbeat, if he stood still long enough to listen for it. Cyrus Bramwell had walked it since before dawn, checking each set, with hands that had long since stopped feeling the cold the way other men felt it. Because cold, out here, wasn't a thing you fought. It was a thing you learned to carry. Same as everything else this mountain handed a man, whether he asked for it or not. 31 years old, alone on that mountain for 6 of them, and every one of those 6 years had taught him the same lesson, over and over, until it had worn a groove into him the way water wears a groove into stone. Slow, patient, undeniable once you looked close enough to see the shape of it. Trust nothing you haven't checked yourself. He pulled an empty trap from beneath a shelf of ice and turned it over in his palm. Empty. Third one today. The pelts were thin this season anyway. Thin pelts. Thin prices. A debt that did not care one way or the other whether the winter gave him anything back. He thought about the letter in his coat pocket. He had not opened it since yesterday. Did not need to. He had read it 11 times already, memorized the shape of the words, if not their exact order, and every time he tried to picture the woman behind them, his mind gave him nothing but a blur. A shape standing at the edge of a stagecoach. A voice he had never heard. Because that was the arrangement now. That was what his life had become. A man too proud to say the word desperate, arranging for a stranger to cross half a continent, because he needed a pair of hands he could trust at the homestead, while he was out here trying to outwalk a debt that grew heavier every time he thought about it. He should have felt something like hope. He felt something closer to dread. Barnabas Yount had a way of appearing exactly when a man least wanted company and most needed it. Cyrus heard the old trapper's mule before he saw him, the animal's hooves cracking, through crusted snow along the ridge trail, and by the time Barnabas came into view, Cyrus had already resigned himself to whatever lecture was coming. "You look like a man chewing on a nail," Barnabas said, by way of greeting. "Traps came up empty." "Traps ain't what's eating you." Cyrus didn't answer that, just kept walking, boots crunching, breath fogging white in front of him, and Barnabas fell, into step beside him the way he'd been falling, into step beside Cyrus for 6 years now. Since before the cabin had a proper roof. Since before any of it. "She due in tomorrow," Barnabas said. "Not a question. Day after. You gonna be at the station. Where else would I be?" Barnabas made a sound in his throat that Cyrus had learned to recognize as disapproval dressed up as neutrality. Just a skin. Man's got a habit of finding reasons to be elsewhere when the thing in front of him scares him more than a grizzly ever could. "Nothing about a stagecoach scares me." "Didn't say it was the stagecoach." Cyrus stopped walking, turned. The wind cut sideways across the ridge and pulled at the brim of his hat, and for a moment neither man said anything, because there was nothing to say that both of them didn't already understand. "I need the help, Barnabas. That's all this is." "Sure. I mean it. Winter like this. A man can't run a trap line and mind a homestead both. Something's gotta give, and it ain't gonna be the traps because the traps are the only thing standing between me and losing that land outright." "I know what it is, Cyrus." "Then quit looking at me like it's something else." Barnabas shrugged, the kind of shrug that said he'd let it go for now, but only for now, and they walked the rest of the ridge without another word between them. Which was fine by Cyrus. Words had a way of making a thing more real than he had the stomach for just then. The debt had a name attached to it, and the name was Jasper Coyle. Cyrus did not think about that name often, could not afford to. A man who let bitterness set up permanent residence in his chest would find it crowding out everything else eventually, until there wasn't room left for anything worth having. But some nights, alone in the cabin, with the fire burned down to coals, the name came anyway, uninvited, and dragged the whole memory in behind it like a carcass on a rope. 2 years back, a man in a fine coat that didn't belong anywhere near a mountain trapper's cabin, riding in on a horse too clean for the roads he claimed to have traveled. Coyle had talked the way certain men talked, smooth, unhurried, like every word had been polished before it ever left his mouth. Cyrus could still see him if he let himself. Sitting at that same kitchen table, hat set down careful on the bench beside him like a man who intended to stay a while. Papers spread out between them, official-looking, stamped with a seal Cyrus had no way of knowing was forged. 2 valleys over, Coyle had said, tapping the map with one clean finger. Essayed twice. I wouldn't bring this to just any man, Mr. Bramwell. Takes a particular kind of grit to see an opportunity like this through, and I've heard enough about you from folks in Sula to know you've got it. Why me? Because you work your own land with your own 2 hands, and you don't owe your soul to a bank in Missoula. Men like that are rare out here. Men like that are exactly who I want standing beside me when this pays out. Cyrus had felt something warm move through his chest at that. Being seen, being singled out. It had felt, in the moment, like the first time in years anybody had looked at his solitary, grinding life and called it something other than stubbornness. What do you need from me? Your stake, matched against mine. We split the claim even soon as the paperwork clears. Coyle had smiled then, easy, unhurried. I wouldn't ask if I didn't believe in it myself, Mr. Bramwell. I've got my own money riding on this same ground. He had not, of course. Cyrus would learn that later, too late to matter, in the same conversation with a land agent in Helena, who informed him, not unkindly, that no assay had ever been filed on that parcel, and that a man matching Coyle's description had worked the same swindle in 2 other territories under 2 other names. Cyrus had believed him. That was the part that still burned even now. Not the money. Money could be earned back, slow as that road was. What burned was the believing. The way he'd sat across from Coyle at his own table in his own cabin, and let the man's confidence do the thinking that Cyrus's own caution should have done for him. He'd handed over 4 years of saved earnings. Every dollar he had, and a note besides, co-signed against the land his father had died proving up, because Coyle's numbers had looked so certain on paper that doubting them had felt at the time like doubting arithmetic itself. The claim did not exist. By the time Cyrus rode out to see it with his own eyes, Coyle was 3 territories gone, and the ground Cyrus stood on was exactly what it looked like. Dirt, rock, nothing underneath it worth a man's life savings. He had ridden back to the cabin that night and sat at the same table, where he'd shaken Coyle's hand, and he had made himself a promise. Simple, unbreakable. Never again would he hand his trust to a stranger on the strength of a story alone. Never again would he take a man's word for something he hadn't verified with his own 2 eyes. He had kept that promise for 2 years now, which was, he understood with a discomfort he did not examine too closely, exactly why he had spent every hour, since mailing his own advertisement, half convinced the woman answering it was lying to him too. The bank in Missoula had given him until spring. Generous, they'd called it. Cyrus had sat across the desk, from a man half his age in a collar too stiff for the work he did, and listened to him explain, with the particular gentleness reserved for men about to lose everything, that the note Coyle had talked him into signing would come due with the thaw, and that the land, his father's land, the only inheritance Cyrus had ever been given or ever wanted, would go to the bank, if he couldn't make it whole by then. Spring felt far away in November. It did not feel far away anymore. Every week that passed shaved another week off a number that had already been too small to begin with, and Cyrus had done what a man in his position does. He'd worked harder, run the line longer, eaten less so the dogs could eat more because a lean dog couldn't track worth a damn, and a lean man could at least keep moving on willpower. But there was only so much a single pair of hands could do, spread across trapping and hauling and mending, and everything else a homestead demanded, and Barnabas had said it to him plain one evening, the two of them sitting either side of the fire with a bottle between them that neither man had touched much. "You need another set of hands, Cyrus. Ain't shameful to say so." "I don't need charity." "Didn't say charity," said Hans. "Same thing, coming from you." Barnabas had laughed at that, short and dry, and thrown another length of wood on the fire before he answered. 11 years I been foreman on outfits bigger'n this one and smaller. I seen plenty of men try to run a place alone out of pure stubbornness. Most of 'em end up losing more than they'd have lost asking for help in the first place. This is different. How's that? Because I already asked for help once. Trusted a stranger's word on it. Cost me near everything I own. Cyrus had stared into the fire a long moment. Forgive me if I'm slow to go looking for another one. A hired hand, and a wife ain't the same kind of trust, Cyrus, and you know it. Barnabas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Coyle sold you a story about ground you never laid eyes on till it was too late to matter. That's a different animal than a woman writing you plain about who she is and what she's looking for. You'll see her face before you sign anything. You'll have the chance to judge for yourself, same as you should have had with that mining claim and didn't take. And if the letter's a lie, same as Coyle's assay papers were, then you'll know it inside a week of her stepping off that coach, same as any man knows a false thing once it's standing in front of him in the daylight. That's the whole difference, Cyrus. Coyle kept himself 2 territories away the whole time he was lying to you. A wife can't do that. She'll be right there in your kitchen, every single day, proving out true, or proving out false in a way no letter ever could on its own. Cyrus hadn't answered that night, had sat with it instead, turning it slow the way he turned most things, and it was near a week later, before he found himself thinking of it again, alone in the cabin, with the wind working at the shutters, and the debt sitting heavy in his chest same as it always did after dark. He thought of the traps he couldn't check because he was mending fence instead. Thought of the fence he couldn't mend because he was hauling wood instead. Thought of the wood he couldn't haul fast enough because winter didn't care one particular bit how many hands a man had to work with, only that the work got done regardless. A second pair of hands would matter. That much wasn't pride talking. That was arithmetic, plain and cold, as the ground outside, and arithmetic was a thing Cyrus had learned, the hard way, to trust considerably more than he trusted a man's smooth voice across a table. He had turned the idea over for 2 more weeks before he finally sat down and wrote the advertisement himself, in handwriting he was faintly embarrassed by, describing a homestead in the Bitterroot Valley, and a man of steady temperament in need of a capable partner. He had not mentioned the debt. He told himself that wasn't dishonest. Told himself a man was entitled to some privacy about his own affairs, especially with a stranger he hadn't met yet. He would think about that particular piece of self-deception again later and not enjoy the thinking. Her letter had come back 4 weeks later, and it had unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. Not because it was dishonest, because it wasn't. Verity Calloway wrote plainly. No flourishes, no overpromising. She described herself as capable with animals, particularly horses, having grown up on her father's horse ranch in Ohio. She mentioned, without apology, that she was not a small woman, and that if size mattered to him more than character, he ought to say so now rather than after she traveled 2,000 miles to find out. She said she was looking for a partnership, not a rescue. She said she did not need saving. She needed a place where her particular gifts would be wanted instead of hidden. Cyrus had read that line 3 times. Wanted instead of hidden. He hadn't understood, then, what kind of history sat behind those 5 words. He understood only that they'd struck something in him he didn't have a name for, and that the striking had made him uneasy in a way he couldn't fully account for. Because here was the thing he could not get past, no matter how many times he turned it over. A letter was just a letter. Coyle had taught him that lesson at his own kitchen table, in his own handwriting on his own promissory note. Person could write anything, could describe herself however she pleased, and there was no way to know, not really, not until you stood across, from the actual living, breathing person, whether the words on the page bore any resemblance at all to the truth standing in front of you. He had learned that lesson once already, learned it hard enough to nearly lose his father's land over it. He was not eager to learn it twice. The morning of her arrival came in gray and cold, the kind of cold that got into a man's joints and stayed there, and Cyrus stood at the stage station in the small settlement of Sula, with his hat in his hands, and his stomach doing something he refused to call nervousness. Barnabas had ridden down with him. Uninvited. Cyrus hadn't argued the point, mostly because he suspected some part of him wanted the company, even if he'd never have admitted it out loud. "You gonna say something to her?" Barnabas asked. "Or just stand there like a fence post?" "I'll say something." "What?" "I don't know yet." "Something real reassuring." "Nobody asked you to be reassured." The stage came around the bend 20 minutes later. Dust and mud kicked up behind it despite the cold, and Cyrus felt his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. He watched the coach slow, watched it stop, watched the driver climb down and move toward the door, and every second of that felt longer than it had any right to. The door opened, and Cyrus Bramwell, who had spent 6 years alone on a mountain learning to trust nothing he hadn't verified, with his own eyes, found himself verifying something he had not expected to need verifying at all. She was not what the shape in his imagination had settled into. He hated himself immediately and thoroughly, for the way his face must have shown it, because it did show. He felt it happen before he could stop it, some involuntary flicker crossing his features the instant she stepped down from the coach, and by the way her own expression shifted in response, he understood she had seen it too. She was not a small woman. She had said as much in her letter, plainly, without apology, and he had read those words a dozen times, and told himself he understood what they meant. He had not understood. Understanding a fact on paper and standing in front of the living truth of it were two entirely different exercises, and Cyrus's mind, in that first unguarded second, had done something ugly and automatic that he would spend a long time afterward being ashamed of. He had compared her to the blur in his imagination, and found her wanting, which was, he would come to understand, the single greatest misjudgment of his entire life, and he had made it in less time than it took to draw a breath. "Mr. Bramwell." Her voice was steady, steadier than his face apparently was. "I'd know you anywhere. You've got the look of a man who wrote a very careful letter and is now regretting every word of it." Cyrus opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Ma'am, that's it? Ma'am? He stopped, started over. "You made good time." "The stage made good time. I merely sat in it and endured the cold." She looked at him a moment longer, something unreadable moving behind her eyes, and then she looked away, out toward the mountains rising gray and enormous behind the settlement, and when she spoke again her voice had gone quieter. Not hurt exactly, careful. The voice of someone who had learned, a long time ago, how to make herself very still in the moment right, after a disappointment landed. "It's a fine view. It is. You could try looking at it instead of me. Might spare us both." The words landed like a slap, gentle but precise, and Cyrus felt heat crawl up the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the cold. "That's not," he started. "It's exactly what it is, Mr. Bramwell. I've seen the look before. I'll thank you not to make me stand here in the cold pretending otherwise." Barnabas, off to the side, made a sound that might have been a cough, and might have been a laugh badly disguised as one. Cyrus shot him a look that promised a reckoning later. Barnabas did not look remotely repentant. "I'm Barnabas Yount," the old trapper said, stepping forward and touching his hat, filling the silence Cyrus seemed incapable of filling himself. "Friend of Cyrus's. Pleasure, Miss Calloway." "Verity," she said, and something in her posture eased a fraction, as though Barnabas's plain courtesy had cost her less than Cyrus's silence had. "Please." "Verity, then. Let's get your trunk loaded, before this wind decides to get serious. She nodded and moved toward the back of the coach, where her single trunk sat waiting, and Cyrus stood rooted, where he was, feeling something twist uncomfortably in his chest, that he did not yet have the vocabulary to name. Shame, mostly, though it would take him considerably longer than he'd have liked to admit, that to himself in so many words. The wagon ride back to the homestead took the better part of 2 hours, and for most of it nobody spoke. Cyrus drove. Verity sat beside him, wrapped in a traveling cloak that had clearly been chosen for a gentler climate than the one she'd landed in. Her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing country, with the kind of attention that seemed less like sightseeing and more like cataloging. Taking stock. He recognized the look because he did the same thing himself when he was assessing new ground. "You're quiet," she said eventually, not looking at him. "Didn't figure you wanted conversation." "I didn't say that. I said you're quiet." "Same thing, near enough." "It is not the same thing at all, Mr. Bramwell, and I suspect you know it." She turned then, finally, and studied him with an evenness that made him want to look at the road instead. "You've been chewing on something since the station. I'd rather you just say it than let it sit there curdling." He kept his eyes forward. "Nothing to say. There's plenty to say. You're only choosing not to say it, which is a different animal entirely, and considerably less flattering." Cyrus's jaw tightened. "You want me to apologize for a look on my face I didn't ask my face to make. I want you to be honest, since apparently that's a rarer commodity out here than I was led to believe." Her voice had an edge now, sharpened but controlled, the tone of someone who had rehearsed this exact patience many times before and resented needing to draw on it again so soon. "I know what I look like, Mr. Bramwell. I have known it my whole life. I wrote you the truth of it because I'd rather a man's disappointment happen at a stage station 2,000 miles from my family than happen after I'd already unpacked my trunk and started believing something better of him." Cyrus said nothing for a long moment. The wagon wheels ground over frozen ruts. Somewhere off in the trees a raven called, once, and fell silent. "That's a hard way to live," he said finally, "expecting the worst before a man's even opened his mouth. It's a practical way to live. There's a considerable difference between the two, and I think a man alone on a mountain for 6 years would understand practical better than most." That landed closer to the bone than he liked. He didn't answer it. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that felt, if anything, heavier than the one before it. The cabin sat at the mouth of a narrow draw, backed against a stand of lodgepole pine, smoke curling up thin and steady from the chimney, where Barnabas, who had ridden ahead, had already gotten the fire built back up. It was not a large place. 2 rooms and a loft, sturdy enough, weathered gray, built by Cyrus's father, before Cyrus had been old enough to understand what building a life out of nothing actually cost a man. Verity took it in, without comment as the wagon rolled to a stop, and Cyrus found himself watching her face for a reaction he immediately hated himself for watching for. "It's smaller than what you described," she said. "Didn't describe it much." "No, you didn't. I noticed that too." She climbed down from the wagon before he could move to help her, which left him standing there, with his hand half extended, and nowhere useful to put it. "Where would you like the trunk?" "I'll get it." "I asked where, not who." "Inside. By the loft ladder." She nodded and started toward the cabin, and Cyrus stood by the wagon a moment longer, exhaling slow through his nose, trying to understand how a woman he'd known for less than 3 hours had already managed to make him feel like he was constantly one step behind in a conversation he hadn't agreed to be having. Barnabas came around the side of the cabin, wiping his hands on his coat. "She's got some spine on her. That an observation or a warning?" "Bit of both, maybe." Barnabas glanced toward the cabin door, where Verity had already disappeared inside. "You gonna keep looking at her like she's a bill you didn't expect to owe?" Cyrus felt his temper flare, quick and hot. "That an accusation?" "It's an observation, same as before. You can do with it what you like." Barnabas hefted the trunk out of the wagon bed himself, before Cyrus could get to it, grunting under the weight. Woman traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of your letter, Cyrus. Least you can do is not look like you're already sorry you sent it. I never said I was sorry. Didn't have to say it. Face said it plenty loud enough back at the station. Cyrus didn't have an answer for that, mostly because it was true, and there was nothing quite so silencing as being handed the truth by a man who'd earned the right to say it. She unpacked her trunk alone, in the loft, while the light outside went, from gray to blue to the deep, star-scattered black, that only came down over mountains this high. Cyrus could hear her moving above him. Careful, deliberate sounds. A drawer sliding, fabric unfolding. He did not go up to help. Told himself it was propriety. Knew somewhere underneath that it was something closer to cowardice, that he wasn't ready, yet to stand in a small room with her and have nothing useful to say, the way he'd had nothing useful to say all day. Verity, in the loft, moved through the ritual of unpacking, with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. 2 dresses, practical, mended more than once. A Bible that had belonged to her mother, spine cracked soft, from years of use. A small tin box that held, among a few other things, a single pressed wildflower gone the color of old paper, and a letter in her sister's handwriting, that she did not open, not tonight, because some things a woman needed to save for a night, when she had the strength to feel what they'd make her feel. At the bottom, wrapped in a spare petticoat for protection, sat a coil of rope halter, worn soft with use, and a stub of a hairbrush that had belonged to her mother before it belonged to her. She set the halter on the small table by the bed and looked at it a long moment. Some women packed china, packed lace, packed the small fineries a life was supposed to be built around. She had packed the one tool that had ever made her feel like she was worth something to somebody, and she sat there a moment in the cold loft of a stranger's cabin, 2,000 miles, from every face that had ever known her, and let herself feel, just briefly, exactly how much she had staked on a letter and a man's steady temperament. Then she put the feeling away the way she'd learned to put most feelings away, when there was work still ahead of her, and went down to see about supper. Supper that first night was a quiet, careful thing. Verity had insisted on cooking despite the long day of travel behind her, saying she'd rather have something useful to do with her hands than sit idle in an unfamiliar room, and Cyrus hadn't argued the point, mostly because arguing with her seemed to be a losing proposition in every direction he'd tried it so far. She moved through his kitchen like she'd already mapped it, efficient, unhesitating, the kind of competence that came from years of practice rather than performance for an audience, and Cyrus found himself watching her work, with something that felt uncomfortably close to admiration, right up until he remembered he was supposed to still be skeptical of her. "You don't have to prove anything tonight," he said, mostly to fill the silence. "I'm not proving anything. I'm cooking supper." 2 very different activities, though I understand how a man predisposed to doubt might confuse them. "I wasn't doubting. You were absolutely doubting. You've been doubting since the moment that coach door opened, Mr. Bramwell, and I'd rather you own it plainly than keep dressing it up as small talk." He set his jaw. "Fine. I had my doubts. A man's entitled to a few, given what I've—" He stopped himself. "Too late." "Given what?" she said, not letting it go. "Given what you've what?" "Nothing. It is very clearly not nothing." You went pale, as a fish belly the second the words nearly came out of you. Cyrus stared at the fire, jaw working, and for a moment the old promise rose up in him. Never again would he hand his trust to a stranger, except this time it came dressed differently, wearing the shape of a warning about how much a man ought to say to a woman he'd known for a matter of hours. "There was a man," he said finally carefully. "Sold me on something that wasn't real. Cost me near everything I had. That's all I'll say on it tonight." Verity's hands stilled, over the pot for just a moment. Something crossed her face, there and gone too fast for him to read clearly. "That explains a great deal," she said quietly. "Explains what?" "The doubt. The waiting for the worst, before you've even given a person the chance to prove otherwise." She resumed stirring, though her voice had softened, just slightly, the sharp edges of the last hour worn down to something closer to understanding. "I know something of being disbelieved, before I've had the chance to show what I'm actually capable of, Mr. Bramwell. It is not, in my experience, a comfortable place to stand. On either side of it. Cyrus didn't answer that. Didn't trust himself to say the right thing, given how badly he seemed to be doing at saying anything right at all today, and so the two of them ate the rest of the meal in a silence that had, at least, stopped being quite so hostile. It was something. Not much, but something. He watched her clear the plates, watched the careful, unhurried way she moved around a kitchen that wasn't hers yet, and something made him ask the question, before he decided whether he wanted the answer. Why'd you answer an advertisement? From a man you'd never met. Woman with your kind of gift. Seems like you'd have had better offers closer to home. Verity's hands stilled over the wash basin. For a moment he thought she wasn't going to answer at all. I was engaged once, she said finally. Ohio. A banker's son, Edgar. She said the name like it cost her something small to say it. A coin she'd rather not spend, but wasn't ashamed to. He courted me 2 years. Told his whole family I was the finest thing that had ever happened to him. What changed? He came out to the ranch one afternoon and watched me gentle a stud horse that had already thrown his own father's foreman twice that week. Took me the better part of an hour. When I came out of that corral, dust on my dress, hands shaking a little the way they always do after, I expected him to be proud of me. She set a plate down, with more care than the plate required. He was not proud of me, Mr. Bramwell. He was embarrassed. Told me that evening, plain as you please, that a banker's wife didn't wrestle horses in front of half the county, and that I'd need to give the gift up entirely, if I meant to marry him. What did you tell him? I told him no. Didn't take me but a moment to decide it either, which surprised me more than it surprised him. A man who wants you to become smaller so he can feel larger beside you is not a man worth shrinking for. She resumed washing, though her voice had gone quieter, more careful. My father died the following year. Left the ranch to my older brother, who is a decent man, and no gift with horses at all. Within a season I understood the thing I was proudest of in this world had no place left, that wanted it. Your advertisement was the first one I read. That didn't ask me to be smaller. That's the whole of why I answered it, if you're wondering. Cyrus sat with that a long moment, turning it over the way he turned, over most things slow and careful. I didn't ask you to be smaller, he said finally. Whatever my face did at that stagecoach, I never asked that. No, Verity agreed. You didn't. Your face simply told me you'd hoped for something else, without ever having asked me what I actually was. She glanced at him, something almost gentle in it despite the words. There's a difference, but it's a narrower one than you might like to believe, Mr. Bramwell. I'd ask you to remember that the next time your face gets ahead of your manners. He had no answer for that either. He was beginning to keep a private count of exactly how many times in one day a single woman had left him, without a ready answer, and the number was already higher than he was entirely comfortable with. Morning came a second time, and with it came chores that did not care one particular whit about a household still finding its footing. Cyrus found Verity at the woodpile before he'd finished his coffee, already splitting kindling with a technique that was, he had to admit, considerably better than his own, shorter swings, less wasted effort, the kind of economy that came from a lifetime of work rather than a season's practice. You didn't need to do that, he said. Nobody needs to do anything, Mr. Bramwell. Some of us simply prefer not standing idle, while there's daylight to use. She set another length on the block, split it clean. Your axe pulls left. Might want to have somebody true up the handle before it takes your thumb off. You know axes too. I know most things that keep a homestead standing. Grew up on a working ranch, not a parlor. She straightened, wiping her palms on her skirt, and something almost like humor moved behind her eyes. You keep looking surprised every time I turn out to be useful. I think a man in your particular situation would find that reassuring rather than startling. It's both. Well, I suppose that's honest, at least. They had barely gotten the horses fed when a rider came up the trail from the east, and Cyrus recognized the loose, unhurried seat in the saddle before he recognized the face beneath the hat. Wendell Pruitt. 19 years old, from the Dunmore spread 2 ranches over, with the particular restless curiosity of a young man, who had not yet learned that other people's business was not, strictly speaking, his own. Mr. Bramwell. Wendell reined up at the fence, eyes already sliding past Cyrus toward Verity, with an interest he made no effort to disguise. Heard in town you'd gone, and sent for a bride. Word travels. Word always travels. This valley. Wendell tipped his hat toward Verity, who returned the courtesy, with a nod that gave away nothing. Ma'am, pleasure. Mr. Pruitt, I take it. That's right. How'd you? Mr. Yount mentioned the neighboring outfits over supper. You're the only one young enough to still be called by your first name behind your back. Something dry moved at the corner of her mouth. I listened carefully, Mr. Pruitt. You'd do well to remember that, should you ever be tempted to repeat anything you see here today, with more embellishment than it deserves. Wendell laughed, a little startled, and glanced at Cyrus. She's a sharp one. You've no idea, Cyrus said, and found, to his own surprise, that he'd said it, without any of the bitterness the words might once have carried. Wendell lingered a while longer, made some thin excuse about checking a fence line that ran nowhere near Cyrus's land, and rode off eventually, with a last curious look thrown back, over his shoulder toward the corral, where Wraith paced his restless circuit. Cyrus watched him go, and felt, not for the first time, that the particular discomfort of knowing his private troubles had already become the valley's favorite new subject of conversation. He'll tell the whole county by Sunday, Cyrus said. Let him, Verity said. I'd rather they hear it plain, from a curious boy than twisted, from somebody with less generous intentions. Gossip has a way of finding its own level, Mr. Bramwell. Better it starts from something true. He couldn't sleep that night. The loft was his now, seated without much discussion to Verity for the sake of propriety, and Cyrus lay on a bedroll near the banked fire listening to the settling creaks of the cabin, trying not to think. Failing at it, because the thinking came anyway, the way it always did once the fire burned low, and the dark closed in, and there was nothing left to busy his hands with. Came in pieces, fragments, a woman's steady voice at a stagecoach door, his own face doing something ugly and involuntary before he'd had the chance to stop it. Coil's smooth, unhurried tone across a kitchen table 2 winters gone. A bank clerk half his age explaining, gently, that spring wasn't so far off after all. Except spring wasn't the deadline anymore. 3 weeks was the deadline now. 3 weeks, and a horse nobody could touch, and a wife he'd wronged inside the first minute of meeting her. He turned onto his side, turned back, which was worse, he found himself wondering. The look on her face at the station, or the look he imagined she'd wear, if the note came due and the land went to the bank anyway, gift or no gift, patience or no patience, and she was left standing on ground that wasn't even his to offer her anymore. He didn't have an answer for that. Didn't want one, honestly, because every answer his mind offered up circled back around to the same uncomfortable place. That he had disappointed her once already on the strength of nothing but a careless first glance. That he might be about to disappoint her a second time on the strength of a debt that had nothing to do with her at all and everything to do with a mistake he'd made long before she ever stepped off that coach. Somewhere above him, in the loft, he heard the faint creak of the bed, as Verity shifted, and he wondered, with a discomfort he couldn't quite place, whether she was lying awake too. He had disappointed her. That much was plain. Not through anything he'd barely said anything at all, which was its own kind of failure, but through the one thing he hadn't managed to control, the look on his face in that first unguarded second, and no amount of careful conversation afterward had erased it. He knew that, had felt it in the careful distance she'd kept all evening, courteous but guarded, like a woman bracing herself for a second disappointment on the heels of the first. And the worst part, the part he kept circling back to and flinching away from, was that he could not entirely say his disappointment had been fair. Because what had he actually been disappointed by? A shape that didn't match some blur he'd conjured in his own head, built out of nothing but hope and a handful of careful sentences on a page. She had told him the truth, plainly, without apology. He was the one who'd failed to actually hear it, who'd let his imagination fill in a picture she'd never promised him in the first place, and then held her responsible for not matching a promise that had only ever existed inside his own skull. Which, and here the thought arrived unwelcome, and he tried to shove it away and failed, was not so very different from what Coyle had done to him. No, that wasn't fair either. Coyle had lied. Verity had told the truth, and Cyrus had simply chosen, in that first unguarded second, not to believe it. He lay there along while turning that distinction over, trying to make it feel as solid as he wanted it to feel and not quite managing it. Somewhere above him, in the loft, he heard the faint creak of the bed as Verity shifted, and he wondered, with a discomfort he couldn't quite place, whether she was lying awake too. He suspected she was. He didn't have the courage to go find out. Morning came hard and bright, the kind of cold, clear light that made the whole valley look carved out of glass, and Cyrus was up, before dawn out of long habit, moving through the chores that never stopped regardless of what else was happening in a man's life. He found Verity already outside, when he came around from the woodpile, standing near the small corral at the edge of the clearing, perfectly still, her cloak wrapped tight against the cold, and something in the particular quality of her stillness made him slow his steps before he reached her. She wasn't looking at the corral fence itself. She was looking past it, into the shadow of the lean-to shelter, where a horse stood apart from the two others Cyrus kept, apart in a way that had nothing to do with the size of the enclosure and everything to do with the animal's own choosing. A black gelding, coat rough and unbrushed, a jagged scar cutting pale across the ridge above his left eye, and even from this distance Cyrus could see the coiled, watchful stillness in him. The stillness of an animal that had decided a long time ago that people generally meant harm. What happened to him? Verity said, without turning. Cyrus came up beside her, following her gaze. Wraith. That's his name or his condition? Despite himself, the corner of Cyrus's mouth twitched. First time since she'd arrived. Little of both, maybe. What happened to him? She said again, more precise this time, the way a person asks a question they intend to get an actual answer to. Cyrus was quiet a moment, watching the horse pace a slow, restless line along the far fence rail. Came to me 2 winters back. Same man who took my savings ran a rough horse trading camp on the side, before word of the mining scheme caught up to him, and he had to clear out fast. Sold off his stock cheap to whoever'd take it, rather than leave it behind for anybody to ask questions over. Wraith was part of that liquidation. He paused. Didn't know then what I know now. Nobody's managed to get a saddle on him since. Nobody's managed much of anything on him since, if I'm honest. Man who ran that camp wasn't gentle with him from what I could piece together after. Horse remembers that kind of thing longer than most people credit. And you kept him anyway. Didn't have much choice. And he's... Cyrus hesitated, weighing how much to say, then decided the woman standing beside him had already proven she had little patience for half-truths. He's about the only thing of real value left on this place, truth told. If I could get him gentled and sold or gentled and put to real work, it'd go a long way toward a debt I'm carrying, that I haven't been entirely forthright with you about. Verity turned to look at him then, and there was something sharp and assessing in her expression that made Cyrus feel, not for the first time since her arrival, that he was the one being read rather than the other way around. What kind of debt? She said. Cyrus exhaled, long and slow, watching his breath cloud in the cold morning air. The kind that costs a man his father's land, if he can't make it whole by spring. Barnabas found them there 20 minutes later, still standing at the fence, and whatever conversation had passed between them in the interval had left a different quality in the air. Less brittle. Not warm exactly, but no longer entirely at war either. You told her, Barnabas said, reading the situation the way he read most things, quick and without much need for explanation. Some of it. About time. Barnabas leaned on the fence rail beside them, eyes on Wraith, who had resumed his restless pacing the moment the third body arrived. She know the whole shape of it? Not all, Cyrus admitted. She knows there's a debt, knows it's tied to Coyle. Doesn't know... He stopped. Doesn't know what... Verity said, and there was an edge in her voice now the particular edge of someone who did not appreciate being talked around rather than talked to. I am standing right here, Mr. Bramwell. If there's a piece of this you're still withholding, I'd rather hear it from you directly than piece it together secondhand. Cyrus rubbed a hand over his jaw. Some habits, it seemed, died harder than others, even when a man knew better. Bank gave me till spring, he said finally. That's true enough. But Barnabas here got word, through a fella in Missoula 2 days back, that the notes changed hands. Somebody bought it up off the bank at a discount. Man looking to move quicker than spring, and looking to take the land rather than the money, if I understand the shape of it right. How much quicker? Verity asked. Barnabas answered before Cyrus could. 3 weeks. Maybe less if the weather don't cooperate for the paperwork to get filed proper. And who bought the note? Verity said. Do you know? Cyrus felt something go tight in his jaw. Fella in Missoula wouldn't give up a name. Said the buyer preferred to stay quiet about it till the papers filed clean. That doesn't strike you as strange. Strikes me as plenty strange. Strikes me as a good deal more than strange if I'm honest, but strange don't pay a debt down any faster, and I've got exactly 3 weeks to worry about the things that do. He looked off toward the ridgeline, jaw set. I'll ask around when I'm next in town. See if anybody's loose enough with talk to let a name slip. You think it's him? Barnabas said quietly. Coyle. I think a man who already took everything I had once doesn't strike me as the type to leave the rest of it lying around unclaimed. Cyrus's voice had gone flat, careful, the tone of a man keeping a much larger feeling on a very short leash. But I don't know it, and I already told myself I wouldn't believe a thing again, without proof standing plain in front of me. So we don't chase ghosts today. Today we've got 3 weeks, 1 horse, and whatever this afternoon turns out to be. Verity studied him a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes, and did not press further. The silence that followed that felt different from every silence that had come before it that day. Heavier. Verity's gaze moved, from Barnabas to Cyrus, and settled there, steady, unblinking, and Cyrus found he couldn't quite meet it. 3 weeks, she repeated. And the only thing standing between you and losing everything your father built is a horse nobody's been able to touch in 2 years. That's about the size of it, yes. Why didn't you say so at the station? Would it have changed your mind about coming? No. The answer came immediate, unhesitating, and something in the certainty of it seemed to surprise even her, based on the small flicker that crossed her face right after she'd said it. But it would have changed how I understood the last day, Mr. Bramwell. A man staring down the loss of everything he owns wears that particular weight differently than a man who's simply disappointed by the woman who stepped off his stagecoach. I might have read your face at that station a good deal more charitably had I known what else was sitting behind it. Cyrus didn't have an answer for that either. He was beginning to suspect he wasn't going to have an answer for most of what Verity Calloway said to him, at least not for some while yet. They walked back toward the cabin in a loose, uneven line, the 3 of them, and it was Barnabas who broke the silence this time, glancing sideways at Verity, with the particular calculation of a man who had known Cyrus long enough to recognize when a stubborn idea was about to become an actual problem. You said in your letter you'd grown up around horses, Barnabas said. Difficult ones, particular. I did. How difficult? Verity considered the question, or perhaps considered how much of the answer she was willing to give to 2 men she'd known for less than a day. My father's ranch took in the animals nobody else wanted. The ones other outfits had given up on, the ones headed for slaughter, because no one had the patience left to try anything gentler. I was the one who worked with them mostly, from the time I was young enough that my mother thought it unbecoming. And you were good at it. I was better than good at it, Mr. Yount. I was the only one in 5 children who had any gift for it at all, and I spent the better part of my youth proving that to men who assumed on sight that I couldn't possibly be capable of what they were watching me do. Cyrus, walking a half-step behind, felt something shift in his chest at that. Some early, uncomfortable recognition, though he couldn't yet have named exactly what it was he was recognizing. You thinking what I'm thinking? Barnabas said to him. not bothering to lower his voice. I don't know what you're thinking. I'm thinking that horse back there has 3 weeks to become worth something to somebody, and I'm thinking we got a woman standing right here who just told us, plain as day, that difficult is exactly the kind of animal she's built for. Verity stopped walking. Cyrus stopped a half-step later, turning to find her studying him, with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not hope exactly. Something more careful than hope. The expression of a woman who had learned, the hard way, not to reach too quickly for a chance, that might be snatched back the moment she showed she wanted it. Is that what you're asking me, Mr. Bramwell? She said. Or is that only what Mr. Yount is asking on your behalf, because you haven't got the nerve to ask it yourself? Cyrus felt heat rise up his neck for the second time in 2 days. I wasn't going to ask you to risk yourself on an animal that's put grown men in splints. I didn't ask whether you were going to. I asked whether you wanted to. The question hung there in the cold morning air, plain and unadorned, and Cyrus understood, with a clarity that unsettled him, that however he answered it was going to matter a great deal more than the words themselves. I don't know, that horse can be gentled by anybody, he said carefully. For men who know horses better than most tried, before you ever arrived. Every one of them came away worse than they went in. I wouldn't feel right asking a woman I've known one day to risk the same, whatever her gift might be. That's not an answer to my question. It's the only answer I've got. Verity studied him a long moment, and something in her posture straightened, some decision settling into place behind her eyes. Then let me put the question differently, she said. Not whether you want me to try, whether you'll let me if I ask it myself. They stood at the fence again that afternoon, all three of them, watching Wraith work his restless circuit along the far rail, and Cyrus found himself doing the mental arithmetic he'd been doing for weeks now, except the numbers had a different shape to them today. 3 weeks until the note came due. One horse that might, if gentled and proven sound, fetch enough at sale, or prove worth enough in labor to close a meaningful piece of the gap between what he owed and what he had. One woman who claimed a gift he had no way, yet of verifying, standing in front of him asking for the chance to prove it on an animal that had already broken 4 grown men's confidence along with their bones. I've watched you work with animals for exactly 1 conversation, he said finally. That's not much to stake a homestead on. No, Verity agreed. It isn't. But it's considerably more than you staked on Jasper Coyle, if the way you two speak of him is any indication, and that arrangement cost you a great deal more than a homestead nearly did, before you even had the chance to see the ground with your own eyes. The comparison landed harder than she likely intended it to, or perhaps exactly as hard as she intended, and Cyrus felt something in his chest go very still. That's a low thing to bring up. It's a true thing to bring up, Mr. Bramwell, and I'd rather be accused of being low than of letting you make the same mistake twice in opposite directions. You trusted a stranger's word once, without seeing the proof for yourself, and it cost you nearly everything. Now you're refusing to trust a stranger's word at all, even when she's standing right in front of you offering to let you watch the proof happen, with your own 2 eyes in daylight, where you can see every part of it. She let that settle a moment before continuing, her voice steadier now, certain in a way it hadn't quite been before. I am not asking you to believe a letter. I am asking you to give me until sundown and to watch. Barnabas, leaning against the fence rail with his arms crossed, made no effort to hide the small, satisfied smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Cyrus said he needed to check the 2 nearest traps, before the light got any shorter, and left the 2 of them at the fence, and told himself the whole walk out that it was only practical. Because the debt didn't stop counting itself down just on account of 1 wager. Because a man, who let a single afternoon's hope distract him from the work still owed, was a man setting himself up for a harder fall later. Except that wasn't the whole truth of it, and he knew it wasn't somewhere around the second empty trap. He was walking away because he didn't trust his own face. Not after yesterday. Whatever it might do next, watching her, he'd rather it happen where nobody was around to read it. The traps came up empty, both of them, which should have soured his mood further, and somehow didn't, because his mind kept sliding back toward the corral no matter how hard he tried to keep it on the work in front of him. wondering what she'd do first, wondering whether 4 men's worth of failure had taught that horse something that couldn't be untaught by patience alone, however real the patience was. Wondering, too, whether he even deserved the outcome he found himself hoping for. He'd earned the doubt. 2 years of it, hard-won, paid for in a debt that still wasn't finished collecting. But hoping, that felt like something he hadn't given himself permission to do in a long while, and it sat strange in his chest the whole walk back, half welcome and half something closer to fear. By the time he came back over the rise, the corral was already in view, and so was she, Verity, standing at the gate with her canvas bag over one shoulder, exactly where he'd left her, exactly as still. He looked at the horse, looked at the woman, looked, finally, at the 3 weeks stretching out ahead of him like a rope, with a badly fraying end, and understood that whatever pride still had a hold on him wasn't worth as much as it used to be, not weighed against everything currently sitting on the other side of the scale. "Until sundown," he said. "Until sundown," Verity agreed. "And if it doesn't work, then you'll have lost nothing you weren't already at risk of losing, and I'll have lost an afternoon. I can live with that arithmetic, Mr. Bramwell. Can you?" He didn't answer right away, didn't entirely trust his voice to come out steady, if he tried. But he nodded once, and something in Verity's shoulders eased at that, some tension she'd been carrying, since the stagecoach door finally loosening its grip, if only a little. "I'll want the corral to myself," she said. "For the first hour, at least. No audience. Just the horse and me. That horse has put 4 men in splints, with an audience watching," Barnabas said. "You sure you want to be alone in there with him?" "I'm not going in there to fight him, Mr. Yount. I'm going in there to listen to what 2 years of being handled badly have taught him to expect, and there's no listening to be done, with an audience standing at the fence making the animal feel cornered on top of everything else he's already carrying." She looked back toward the horse, and something in her expression softened, some old, private understanding moving behind her eyes, that Cyrus suspected went back a good deal further than her father's ranch in Ohio. "He's not wild, gentlemen. Not the way people mean when they use that word to make themselves feel better about giving up on something. He's frightened. There's a considerable difference, and it changes everything about how a person ought to approach him." Cyrus watched her walk toward the cabin to gather whatever she needed, her stride sure despite the uneven ground, despite the cold, despite a day that had started, with a stranger's disappointment written plain across a man's face at a stagecoach door, and had somehow, by afternoon, turned into this. A wager, a chance, something that felt, against every instinct 6 years of solitary caution had trained, into him dangerously close to hope. He knew he ought to be out on the trap line, knew the debt didn't pause itself for a woman, and a horse, and an afternoon's uncertain gamble, and some old, practical part of him wanted to say, so out loud. He couldn't really, because whatever this was, whatever was about to happen in that corral, he understood, without being able to explain exactly why, that he needed to be standing at that fence when it did. Barnabas seemed to understand it too, without needing to be told. Neither man moved. "She reminds me of somebody," Barnabas said quietly, once she was out of earshot. "Who's that?" "You, before Coyle got his hooks in you. Man who used to believe things could work out, if he just put the honest work in." Barnabas glanced sideways at him. "Might do you some good to remember what that fella sounded like, case you run into him again somewhere down the road." Cyrus didn't answer that, just watched the cabin door, where Verity had disappeared, and turned the day's whole strange shape over in his mind and found, somewhere underneath all the doubt he was still carrying, a small and stubborn thread of something that felt almost like the beginning of belief. He did not trust it yet, but for the first time, since the stagecoach door had opened, he did not entirely want to shove it away either. She had packed the canvas bag with the same 3 things she always packed. A soft rope halter, worn smooth from years of use. A small tin of grain, more for the ritual of offering than for any real bribery it accomplished. And a stub of a hairbrush her mother had given her years back, before her mother had understood what her daughter's gift would eventually cost the family in whispered opinions around church socials. She had not told Cyrus that this was not the first time she'd staked everything she had left on an afternoon like this one. Not the second time, either, because that was the part nobody saw when they watched her work. Not the patience. Not the gift. What they never saw was the small, private terror she carried into every one of these corrals. The fear that this might be the time the gift didn't answer. When she called on it, the time 4 hours of stillness bought her nothing but bruises and a fresh humiliation to carry home. Except she had no home to carry it home to anymore. Not one that wanted her, anyway. Which meant this corral, this horse, this cold gray afternoon in a valley she'd known for exactly 2 days, was not a demonstration. It was the whole of what she had left to offer. She thought of Edgar briefly, unwillingly, the way his face had gone tight, and ashamed watching her do the very thing she was about to do now. Pushed the thought away. Thought instead of her father, who had never once looked at her that way. Who had simply handed her the halter, the first time, and said nothing at all except that the horse would tell her everything she needed to know, if she was patient enough to listen. She meant to listen. She paused at the gate a moment, canvas bag over one shoulder, and looked back once at the 2 men standing well clear of the fence. "Sundown," she said. "Sundown," Cyrus agreed. She nodded once and turned back to the gate. And Cyrus, watching her hands settle on the latch, found himself holding a breath he hadn't decided to hold. Because that was the thing about a wager like this one. It wasn't only the horse being tested. It wasn't only 3 weeks, and a debt, and a piece of land his father had bled to prove up. It was every hard lesson Cyrus had learned, since Coyle rode off with his savings, every wall he'd built up brick by careful brick against the next smooth stranger, who might come along promising something too good to be true. Except she wasn't promising. That was what kept catching in his chest, and refusing to let go. She hadn't promised him anything at all. Only asked for the chance to show it plain in daylight where a man could watch every part of it happen with his own 2 eyes. Which was, when he let himself sit with it, exactly the proof he'd sworn 2 years ago he'd never again go without. She lifted the latch, stepped through. Wraith's head came up sharp the instant the gate swung, ears pinning flat, and he wheeled away toward the far rail with the same wary, coiled energy Cyrus had watched him show every single person who'd ever entered that enclosure. For men, for failures, and now a 5th, smaller than any of them, carrying nothing but a canvas bag, and a patient Cyrus still wasn't entirely sure he believed in. Verity did not approach him. She simply stood, just inside the gate, and let the cold afternoon stretch out around her, unhurried, and Cyrus settled onto the fence rail to watch, Barnabas beside him, and for a long, while neither man said a word, because there was nothing left worth saying, that the afternoon wasn't already saying for them. Wraith paced the far fence line in tight, agitated circles, snorting each time his path carried him nearest to the still figure at the gate, tossing his scarred head like a man shaking off a memory he couldn't outrun no matter how many times he tried. 20 minutes in, Cyrus couldn't stand the silence anymore. Mrs. Bramwell. His own voice sounded strange to him, calling her that for the first time out loud, and he saw the smallest hitch in her shoulders that told him she'd noticed it too. Horse is meant to be broken, not admired. He's been rushed by 4 men already, Mr. Bramwell. She didn't turn, didn't so much as glance his way. I am not in any particular hurry to become the 5th. If you'd like to shorten the wager, you're welcome to call it now, and keep your doubts intact. Barnabas made a sound low in his throat that might have been a laugh, quickly swallowed. Cyrus felt heat crawl up his neck, and said nothing further, because there was, he had to admit, nothing further worth saying. By the end of the first hour, something had shifted. Small, almost too small to name. Wraith had stopped snorting each time his circuit carried him near the gate. His pacing had tightened, drawing his path closer to Verity's still figure than it had ever drawn toward any of the 4 men who'd tried, before her, and Cyrus, watching with an attention he hadn't fully intended to give, found he could not have said exactly what had changed. Only that something clearly had. Verity finally moved. 3 slow steps toward the center of the corral. Then stillness again, offering the horse nothing, but her continued patient presence, and Wraith, watching this new development, from the fence line, took one hesitant step toward her, before catching himself, and retreating hard, ears flat, whole body coiled to run. "Ain't a breaking," Barnabas murmured. "Not yet." He shifted his weight against the rail, eyes narrowed on the horse's shifting stance. "But I been foreman on this kind of outfit going on 11 years, Cyrus, and I ain't never once seen that animal let a stranger's shadow fall that close to him without bolting clean to the other end of the corral." "No, but it ain't nothing either." Cyrus didn't answer. Couldn't really, because his throat had gone tight in a way he wasn't prepared to examine too closely. Watching a woman he'd known for barely 2 days stand steady and unarmed in front of an animal that had put 4 grown men in splints, asking nothing of it but the chance to be trusted. He thought of Coil. Couldn't help it. The thought arrived uninvited the way it always did, dragging the old bitterness in behind it, and he found himself doing something he hadn't done in 2 years, turning that bitterness over and finding it didn't fit quite the same as it used to. Coil had asked for his trust, and given nothing real in return. Verity was asking for nothing at all. Just time. Just the chance to prove a thing plain, in the open, where doubt had nowhere left to hide, from the evidence of its own eyes. Which was, Cyrus understood with a discomfort, that sat strange alongside something, that felt uncomfortably close to hope, exactly the kind of proof he'd promised himself 2 years back he'd never again go without demanding. He had demanded it. She was giving it, hour by patient hour, out there in the cold, with a horse neither of them yet understood. The light had already begun its long, slow slide toward the western ridge, gold going amber at the edges, and Cyrus Bramwell sat on his own fence rail, with his own foreman beside him, and watched his wife of 2 days stand motionless in a corral, and understood with a clarity that unsettled him more than any stranger's smooth promise ever had, that whatever happened between now and sundown was going to matter a great deal more than a debt, or a deed, or 3 weeks on a banker's calendar. 3 weeks until the note came due. 1 horse that might, if this worked, be worth enough to matter. 1 woman he had wronged, with a single unguarded look at a stagecoach door, and was only now, hour by patient hour, beginning to understand the size of. Cyrus Bramwell watched his wife stand still in the cold, with a wounded animal neither of them fully understood yet, and felt something move through his chest that was not quite trust. Not yet, but close enough to it that he was no longer entirely sure how to tell the difference, and for a man who had sworn 2 winters back at his own kitchen table, never again to feel anything of the kind, without proof standing plainly in front of him, that uncertainty was itself a kind of beginning. The second hour did not announce itself. It simply arrived, the way real change always seemed to arrive on that mountain quietly underneath whatever a person thought they were watching, until they looked up and realized the ground had shifted without permission. Verity had closed the distance to within 10 feet of the gelding by then. Not by pushing toward him. Never that. She moved only, when Wraith himself allowed it, some small softening in his shoulders, or his ears giving her leave, and retreated the instant his weight shifted toward flight. 10 feet, then 8, then a long-held stillness that stretched, so far past comfortable, that Cyrus found himself holding his own breath along with the horses. Barnabas broke the silence first. "I have worked this valley 11 years, he said, quiet, like the words might spook something, if he said them too loud. Never once seen anybody get this close to him, without a rope already in hand." Cyrus said nothing. Couldn't. His throat had gone tight watching his wife extend one hand, slow, palm down, toward an animal that had broken bones and reputations across 2 full years, and he felt his certainty about how this afternoon would end begin, for the first time, to genuinely crack. The first touch came without ceremony. A brief, feather-light contact between Verity's fingers and the horse's lowered nose. Gone almost before it happened. Followed immediately by her retreat, unhurried, giving Wraith the room to sit, with whatever had just occurred, without any pressure to accept more than he was ready to give. He did not bolt. He stood there instead, ears forward now instead of pinned back, watching her retreating figure with an attention that looked, to Cyrus's increasingly uncertain eye, considerably less like fear, and considerably more like something he hadn't expected to see on that animal ever again. Curiosity. "Mr. Bramwell." Barnabas's voice, low. I believe you may be about to lose more than a dress. It's one touch, Barnabas. Cyrus said it mostly to convince himself, and both men standing at that fence understood as much, though neither one remarked on it. Horse through 4 men, after a good deal more encouragement than one touch. But even as the words left him, Cyrus understood he was no longer watching the afternoon the way he had at dawn. Not with the settled certainty of a man observing a foregone conclusion. He was watching now with the specific, uncomfortable attention of a man whose doubt was being dismantled in real time. One patient minute at a time, by a woman he had wronged, before he'd ever given her the chance to prove otherwise. Word travels fast in a valley with few enough ranches that everyone knows everyone's business, and by the time the light had shifted from midday flat to the longer, warmer slant of early afternoon, a small crowd had gathered along the fence. Wendell Pruitt came back first, unsurprising, trailing 2 other hands from outfits Cyrus barely knew by name. Behind them, a woman from the Osgood place rode in on some invented errand about borrowed flour, though everybody standing at that rail understood plainly enough what had actually drawn her. She's got him touching her, Wendell said low to nobody in particular, for hours in, and she's got that horse letting her touch him. Shut up and watch, boy, Barnabas said, not unkindly. Verity worked through the crowd's arrival with the same unhurried patience she'd shown all afternoon, unbothered by the growing audience, her whole attention fixed on the horse in front of her. By the 3rd hour she could run a hand along the full length of Wraith's neck, and the gelding had begun, in small increments, to lean very slightly into her touch instead of merely enduring it. The halter came out at the height of that 3rd hour. Soft rope, not the heavier tack the 4 previous men had all tried to force onto the horse at the very start of their own failed efforts. Verity did not attempt to place it immediately. She held it first. Let Wraith investigate it, with his nose, smelling it, nudging it, satisfying whatever calculation a distrustful animal makes, before accepting something new near its head. Only after several long minutes of this did she begin, with excruciating slowness, to work the halter into position. Cyrus watched the whole process, with his arms no longer crossed. His earlier posture of amused certainty had been replaced, sometime in the last 2 hours, by something closer to fixed silent attention, and when the halter finally settled into place around Wraith's head, without a single moment of panic, a small, surprised sound went through the crowd at the fence. Half a gasp, half something closer to a cheer, quickly suppressed out of respect for the moment's fragility. 2 years, Barnabas said beside him. 2 years and 4 men, and she's got him haltered in 3 hours, without ever once raising her voice. Cyrus didn't answer. He was watching his wife run one hand slowly along the scarred ridge, over Wraith's eye, the old wound that had earned the horse his name in the first place, and watching the animal permit the touch without flinching. And Cyrus Bramwell understood, standing at his own fence in the middle of his own afternoon, that every doubt he had carried onto that corral rail at dawn had just been methodically, patiently dismantled by a woman, whose letter he had not fully believed. By the 4th hour, Verity had progressed from the halter to a lead line, walking Wraith in slow, wide circles around the corral, the gelding following at her shoulder, with none of the resistance or shying that had marked every previous attempt at even the most basic handling. The crowd at the fence had grown to nearly a dozen. Cyrus stood among them, no longer the skeptical husband of an untested bride, but a man watching, with something approaching wonder, a demonstration of skill more complete than anything he'd witnessed in 2 years of failed attempts by men he'd trusted considerably more than he'd trusted his own new wife. Verity paused the circling walk near the fence, where he stood, close enough now for quiet conversation, and said without any particular triumph in her tone, "He was never wild, Mr. Bramwell. For men tried force," Cyrus said. "None of them thought to try patience. Patience is slower, and considerably less satisfying to a man who wants credit for the taming." She let that sit a moment, watching Wraith's ears flick toward her voice rather than away. From it, a small sign she'd learned, somewhere along the way, to read as trust rather than mere tolerance. "I found the same is true of most difficult things. A man who wants credit rushes it." A man who only wants the trust itself learns to wait. Cyrus looked at his wife, standing calm and unhurried beside a horse that had cost him 2 years and 4 men's worth of bruises, and opened his mouth to say something he hadn't fully planned yet. The wind answered before he could. Came in fast. Faster than any of them had reason to expect, given how clear the morning had started, and how still the early afternoon had stayed, and Cyrus felt it before he heard it. A pressure change in his ears, a heaviness settling into the air, that 6 years on, that mountain had taught him to recognize the way a sailor learns to recognize weather. He should have caught it sooner. That was the thought that would return to him later, again and again, worrying at him like a splinter he couldn't quite work free. Should have caught it sooner. Should have been watching the ridge instead of watching her hands on the lead line. Should have trusted the old instincts instead of letting himself get lost in the particular wonder of watching 2 years of fear come slowly undone in front of him. Because that was exactly the kind of distraction this mountain punished a man for. Every trapper who'd ever died up here had died the same way, more or less. Not from the cold itself. From the moment they stopped paying the cold the attention it demanded. "Storm's coming," he said, already turning toward the western ridge. Barnabas was already looking the same direction, jaw tight. Coming fast. The sky over the peaks had gone the color of a fresh bruise, purple, black, and swollen, and even as Cyrus watched, the first hard gusts came tearing down off the ridge, carrying with them a fine stinging spray of snow that hadn't been falling 10 minutes earlier. Because that was the particular cruelty of mountain weather. It didn't warn a person, didn't build slow and courteous the way weather was supposed to build. It simply arrived all at once, indifferent to whatever a person happened to be in the middle of doing, when it decided to. And what Verity happened to be in the middle of doing was standing in an open corral, on a lead line, with a horse that had spent 2 years learning the world was not to be trusted. Verity! Cyrus's voice came out sharper than he meant it. Get him toward the shelter. Now. She was already moving, already reading the change in the sky same as he had, but Wraith read it faster than either of them. The gelding's head snapped up, ears pinning flat, every muscle in his body going rigid, as the wind hit a second gust, harder than the first, and a loose section of the lean-to-roof tore free somewhere behind him with a crack like a rifle shot. The horse bolted, not away from Verity. That was the part that would haunt Cyrus later, turning it over in the dark. Wraith didn't run from her. He ran through the panic that 2 years of fear had trained, into him blind and total, and the lead line still looped loose around Verity's wrist yanked her forward off her feet, before she could think to release it. Verity! Cyrus was already moving, already over the fence rail, before his mind had finished processing what his body had decided to do, boots hitting frozen ground hard enough to jar his teeth, and the whole world had narrowed down to one single screaming fact. She was down, on the ground, and 1,100 pounds of terrified horse was wheeling in a tight, panicked circle not 6 feet from where she'd fallen. He would not remember later exactly how he closed the distance, would remember only pieces of it. The specific, sickening color of the sky, the way the snow had turned sideways, stinging his face raw. His own boots slipping once on ice-slicked ground, and somehow finding purchase again, without his mind ever fully registering the stumble. The sound of his own voice, low and steady, pitched the way he'd learned to pitch it for spooked pack animals on narrow mountain trails, saying words that had no particular meaning except the meaning underneath them. Easy. Easy now. Easy. Because there wasn't time to think past that. Wasn't time to weigh the wager or the debt, or any of the careful reasoning he'd built up over 2 years about never handing his trust to anything he hadn't verified first. There was only Verity on the ground, and a horse's hooves cutting the air, where her head had been not 2 seconds before. He got between Verity and the horse before conscious thought had caught up, with instinct, one arm sweeping wide to block Wraith's line, and for one long, terrible second the gelding reared, forelegs pawing the churning air not 3 feet above Cyrus's head, close enough that he felt the wind of it against his face, close enough that some distant, still functioning corner of his mind understood, with perfect clarity, exactly how this could end. Cyrus! Barnabas's voice, distant, urgent, from somewhere back at the fence. Cyrus didn't look, couldn't spare the attention. He kept his eyes locked on the horse, kept his voice low, and even despite everything in his chest screaming at a considerably higher pitch, and reached up, slow, deliberate, and closed his hand around the lead line. Wraith came down hard, skittered sideways, every instinct in the animal straining toward flight, and for a moment Cyrus felt the full weight of that panic transmit itself straight up the taut line, into his own arm, into his own shoulder, a living thing trying to tear itself free of him. "Easy," he said again, and this time something in his own voice surprised him. Steadier than he felt, steadier than he had any right to feel, with a woman on the ground behind him, and a half-ton of panicked horseflesh still deciding whether to run, through him or around him. "Nobody's gonna hurt you. Not here. Not today." He didn't know if the words meant anything to the animal. He knew they meant something to him, saying them, and somewhere in the middle of that thought Wraith's wild circling slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. Enough that Cyrus could plant his feet, brace against the pull, and hold. Behind him, he heard Verity's voice, breathless but steady. "Cyrus, I'm all right. I'm all right, don't—" "Stay down," he said, not turning. "Stay down till I've got him." She stayed down. He would remember that too later, the discipline it must have cost her, lying there in the snow with her ankle already screaming, and every instinct in her likely telling her to scramble clear, and choosing instead to trust his judgment over her own fear. The wind screamed past them both, snow driving nearly horizontal now, and for a long, suspended moment the whole world narrowed down to the width of a lead line, and the trembling animal on the other end of it. Cyrus's arm burned, with the effort of holding steady. His face had gone numb where the snow struck it, and still he held, and still he kept his voice low, and still he said the same 3 words over and over until they stopped being words at all, and became something closer to a rhythm, a heartbeat, a thing the horse could hold onto same as Cyrus was holding onto the line. Then slowly, impossibly slowly, Wraith's ears came forward, the gelding's sides heaved, breath coming in great ragged clouds, but the wild rolling white had gone out of his eyes, and when Cyrus finally dared to take one careful step toward the shelter, tugging gently rather than pulling, Wraith followed. One step, then another. Cyrus did not let himself feel anything, until the horse was inside the lean-to, out of the worst of the wind, and only then did his knees nearly give out beneath him, the whole of what had just happened crashing down on him all at once now, that there was finally room for it to land. The storm broke as fast as it had come, the way mountain storms sometimes did, spending its fury in one violent quarter hour, before rolling east, over the ridge, and leaving the valley behind it scoured clean, and startlingly quiet. Cyrus got Wraith into the shelter first, hands steady despite everything in him that wasn't. Then he turned and found Verity already on her feet, favoring one ankle, but upright, snow melting in her hair, and something in his chest did something he had no ready name for. "You're hurt," he said. "Twisted my ankle. Nothing worse." She was watching him, with an expression he couldn't fully read, something caught between shaken and something else entirely. "You came over that fence like a man half his age. Wasn't thinking about my age. What were you thinking about?" He didn't answer right away. The honest answer sat too close to something he wasn't ready to say out loud. Not yet, not with Barnabas, and half the valley still standing at that fence catching their breath along with everybody else. "You," he said finally, quiet, "wasn't thinking about much past you." Something moved across Verity's face then, quick and unguarded, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the whole corral gone still except for the sound of Wraith's breathing settling in the shelter behind them, and the drip of melting snow off the fence rail. "You broke your own rule," she said eventually. "No interference. Wasn't that the wager? Wager didn't account for a storm nearly killing you." "No," she agreed, quiet. "I don't suppose it did." Barnabas, arriving at a careful distance, cleared his throat loud enough to announce himself, before he got closer, and whatever moment had been building between them folded itself away, unfinished, the way these things did, when the world insisted on continuing regardless. "Everybody in one piece?" the old trapper asked. "Near enough," Cyrus said. Barnabas looked at Wraith, standing calmer now in the shelter than Cyrus had ever seen him stand around a person. And something in the old man's expression shifted, not surprise exactly. Recognition, the particular look of a man whose memory had just been jarred loose by something he hadn't expected to see twice in one lifetime. "That scar," Barnabas said slowly. "What about it? I've seen a horse take a mark like that before. Exact same place. Exact same shape." He was still staring at Wraith, something working behind his eyes that Cyrus didn't like the look of. "Long time back. Before you bought this land, even." "Where?" Barnabas didn't answer right away, and something in his hesitation set a cold, uneasy weight low in Cyrus's stomach that had nothing to do with the storm that had just passed. The old trapper's eyes stayed fixed on the horse a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had gone somewhere distant, somewhere back in years he didn't often let himself visit out loud. "There was a horse camp, east side of the valley, run by a trader passing through. For years back, maybe 5. I was hauling supplies for an outfit that don't exist no more, and I stopped there to water my mules." Barnabas's jaw worked, the memory coming slow and reluctant, like a splinter finally working itself loose from old flesh. Man had maybe a dozen horses penned up, rough stock, animals nobody with sense would have paid full price for. And there was this one black gelding, wouldn't load into the trailer he was fixing to haul it off in. "What happened?" Cyrus asked, though some part of him already didn't want the answer. Man lost his temper. Fast, ugly temper, the kind that don't build up slow, just arrives all at once, same as that storm yesterday. Took a quirt to the horse's face. Right over the eye. Barnabas's voice had gone flat. The particular flatness of a man describing something he'd wished, for years, he could unremember. Horse went down on its front knees. Didn't make a sound, which was somehow worse than if it had. I hollered at the man to stop, and he looked at me like I'd interrupted him doing something perfectly reasonable, like disciplining a horse that wouldn't load right was just ordinary business. You remember his face. I remember it plain enough now that I've seen it again in my mind since yesterday. Fine coat, even out there in the dust and the horseflies. Talked smooth, even angry. Told me the horse was his business, and I'd best mind my own. Barnabas looked at Cyrus directly then. I didn't have a name for him then. Wouldn't have thought of it again in my whole life if you hadn't gone and lost your savings to a man matching that same description 2 winters back. Cyrus felt something cold and still settle into his chest, the pieces arranging themselves into a shape he didn't want to look at directly. "You're certain," he said again. "Certain as I can be without papers to prove it." Barnabas held his gaze steady. "And there's more. They got Verity inside and the ankle wrapped, and Cyrus built the fire up higher than the evening strictly required, mostly because his hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. She sat near the hearth with her foot propped on a stool, watching him work, and for a long, while neither of them spoke, the events of the afternoon still settling into whatever shape they were eventually going to take. "You could have been trampled," Cyrus said finally. "I wasn't, because I got there in time. If I hadn't—" "Cyrus," she said his given name plain, no formality attached to it, and something about hearing it that way stopped him mid-sentence. "You did get there in time. I would rather sit here grateful for that than spend the evening imagining every way it might have gone worse. I found dwelling on what didn't happen is a poor use of an evening a person's lucky enough to still be having." He looked at her a long moment. "You're not shaken at all, are you?" "I am considerably shaken, Mr. Bramwell. I am simply not in the habit of showing it to people until I've had the privacy to feel it properly." Something dry moved at the corner of her mouth, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You'll find I keep most things close until I trust the room I'm standing in. It's a hard habit to break." "Do you trust this room?" The question came out before he'd fully decided to ask it, and he watched her consider it with the same careful weight she seemed to give most things. "More than I did yesterday," she said. "Considerably more than I did yesterday. If I'm honest, watching a man go over a fence rail without stopping to think twice about it." Cyrus didn't have a ready answer for that. sat with it instead, the fire cracking and popping between them, and understood somewhere in the quiet of that moment that whatever this thing was building between them, it had stopped being about a wager sometime in the last few hours. He wasn't sure yet what to call it instead. "Can I ask you something?" he said after a while. "You can ask. Whether I answer depends entirely on the question. Back there, in the storm, you didn't scream." He'd been turning it over since it happened, the particular strangeness of it. Woman goes down under a spooked horse, most would have screamed. You just said my name once, and went quiet. Screaming startles a frightened animal further, Verity said simply. I learned that lesson a long time before I learned most other things. A body can be terrified, and still choose not to make the terror worse for whatever's standing closest to it. She looked at the fire a moment, something distant crossing her face. It isn't bravery, if that's what you're circling toward asking. It's only practice. I've had a great deal of practice keeping myself quiet in moments that frighten me considerably. Doesn't sound like a kind of practice to get. No, she agreed, quiet. It generally isn't. He wanted to ask what she meant by that. Wanted to ask what other moments, what other fears, had taught a woman to go still and silent instead of loud, when the world came apart around her. But something in the careful way she'd said it told him this wasn't the night for asking, and Cyrus was learning, slow as he was learning most things about her, when to let a door stay closed a while longer. For what it's worth, he said instead. I'm glad you're the kind that goes quiet instead of the kind that panics. Man could get used to having somebody steady beside him. Something moved across her face at that, surprise, maybe, or something gentler than surprise, and for a moment the space between them felt smaller than the width of a hearth ought to allow. Careful, Mr. Bramwell, she said, though her voice had lost its earlier edge entirely. A woman could get used to hearing that kind of thing, and then where would you be? Reckon I'd be exactly where I am now, just with less doubt about it. He wasn't in any particular hurry to find out what to call the thing building between them either. Some things he was beginning to learn, from the woman across the hearth, from him were better arrived at slow. Verity woke twice in the night. Both times to the same sound, Cyrus, below in the main room, moving quietly to the window, and standing there along, while before returning to his bedroll, restless in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She understood it without needing to ask. Some fears didn't wait politely for daylight to be reckoned with. They came in the dark, when a person had nothing left to distract them, from the shape of what frightened them most, and she recognized the particular quality of that restlessness because she'd carried plenty of her own, over the years, pacing floors in the small hours, while a family slept unaware just beyond a thin wall. She did not go down to him. Not yet. Some men needed the dark to themselves, before they were ready to hand a piece of their fear to somebody else, and she suspected Cyrus Bramwell was exactly that particular kind of man. She would learn, before this was over, precisely how right she was. Barnabas came by the next morning, before Cyrus had finished his coffee, a folded paper in his hand, and a grimmer look on his face than Cyrus had seen there in some while. Rode to Sula at first light, Barnabas said, not bothering with greetings. Fella at the land office owed me a favor from years back. Asked him quiet like to check whose name was behind the note purchase on your claim. Cyrus set his cup down slow. And Barnabas set the paper on the table between them. Wasn't filed under Coyle's own name. Man's too careful for that. Filed under a company name instead, Territorial Mining and Land Concern. But the fella at the land office recognized the signature on the transfer papers all the same. Says he's seen that same hand write out 3 other transfers the same territory, each one signed different, each one filed under some new company name that don't exist nowhere but on paper. Same hand as the silver claim papers he showed me 2 winters back. That's my understanding, yes? Something cold settled into Cyrus's chest, hard and absolute. The last uncertain edges of doubt finally closing shut around a single unbending fact. He's still in the territory. I believe he is, and I believe you already suspected as much yesterday, whether you wanted to say it out loud or not. Cyrus looked toward the window, toward the corral, where Wraith stood in the pale morning light, quieter than Cyrus had ever seen him, and understood with a clarity that settled hard and cold in his chest that the man who had gutted his savings and the man who had put that scar over a frightened animal's eye were one and the same. That his own wound and the horse's wound had come from the identical hand. Verity limped out to join them at the table, her ankle wrapped tight, and listened to the whole of it without interrupting, her expression going carefully still in a way Cyrus was beginning to recognize as the shape she wore when she was working something through rather than simply reacting to it. "If it's the same man," she said finally. "He's not finished. Men like that rarely stop at one debt collected." "What makes you say that?" Cyrus asked. "Because a man who builds his whole living on other people's trust doesn't retire the trade once it's paid off well. He simply moves to the next mark." She looked between the two men, something hard settling into her expression. "You should ask around quietly whether anyone else in this valley has been approached with a similar opportunity lately. I'd wager money you don't currently have, that you're not the only family he's got his hooks into." Barnabas and Cyrus exchanged a look, and something in Barnabas's face told Cyrus the old trapper had already been turning the same thought over before Verity ever said it plain. "There's been talk," Barnabas admitted slowly. "Down at the Osgood place. New fella been courting old man Osgood's confidence the last few weeks. Talking up some kind of investment. I didn't think much of it till just now." Cyrus felt his jaw tighten. The Osgoods, decent people, hardworking, 3 seasons behind on their own note, same as half the valley. Exactly the kind of family a man like Coyle would circle like a wolf reading the weakest animal in a herd. "I need to know for certain," Cyrus said. "Before I do anything else, I need to know it's him, and I need to know what he's got planned for the Osgoods before he finishes whatever he started." "How do you mean to find that out?" Verity asked. Cyrus looked at her a long moment, something settling into place behind his eyes that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "Resolve, maybe, or something harder than resolve. I mean to go ask him myself." Wendell Pruitt rode up not 2 hours later, breathless, his horse lathered from a hard ride, and the news he carried confirmed everything Barnabas had already begun to suspect. "Mr. Osgood's fixing to sign papers by week's end," Wendell said, still catching his breath. "Heard it myself down at the Mercantile. Fella's been out to the Osgood place 3 times now, talking up some silver claim 2 valleys south. Same kind of talk you hear folks warn each other about, except old man Osgood's too far in already to hear the warning." "Did you see him?" Cyrus asked. "The man doing the talking." "Saw him plain. Fine coat. Talks smooth as creek water." Wendell hesitated, glancing between Cyrus and Barnabas with the particular unease of a young man realizing he's stepped into something larger than gossip. "Fella went by the name Coyle, Mr. Bramwell. Same name I heard folks mention when they talk about what happened to you 2 winters back." The name settled into the room like a physical weight, and Cyrus felt something in his chest go very still and very cold all at once. "How much time," he said, "before the Osgoods sign?" "Week's end, near as I heard it. Maybe sooner." Cyrus looked out toward the corral again, toward Wraith standing quiet in the pale morning light, and felt the whole shape of the last 2 days settle into something he could finally see clearly. A debt bought quiet and deliberate, a horse scarred by the same cruel hand that had scarred his own trust in nearly everyone he met. A family down the valley about to walk into the exact same trap that had nearly cost him everything. 3 weeks until his own note came due, considerably less time than that before the Osgoods signed away whatever they had left to lose. "I'm not waiting for him to come collect," Cyrus said, quiet, final. "I'm going to him, tonight if I can manage it, before he's got the Osgoods names on paper same as he once had mine." Verity caught his arm as he reached for his coat, her grip firmer than her injured ankle should have allowed for, and something in her expression stopped him mid-motion. "Not alone," she said. "This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment I married into this homestead, Mr. Bramwell, whether either of us planned it that way or not." Her jaw was set, the same stubborn set he'd watched hold steady through an entire afternoon, with a horse twice her size and considerably less patient than she was. You go charging in there alone, angry, and a man like that will find some way to use your anger against you. He's built a whole living out of reading exactly that kind of weakness in people. So what would you have me do instead? Not walk in his front door tonight at all. Not yet. She held his gaze steady, unflinching. You said it yourself. He's smooth, practiced. A man like that will see fury coming from a mile off and have some clever answer ready before you've even finished your first sentence. Walk in on him tonight angry without anything solid in your hands, and he'll talk his way clear of it same as he talked his way into your savings 2 winters back. Then what do you suggest? That we go see for ourselves what's actually happening at the Osgood place. Quiet. Tonight, while there's still time, before whatever he's planning finishes itself. Not to confront him, only to see. She glanced at Barnabas. You know that land better than either of us, Mr. Yount. Is there a way to get close without being seen? Barnabas considered it, chewing the question over the way he chewed over most things. There's a ridge trail runs above the Osgood place. Man could get a clear look down at the house, from up there, moonlight or lamplight permitting, without ever setting foot on Osgood ground itself. Cyrus looked between the two of them, the fury still burning hot in his chest, and felt it slowly, reluctantly, reshape itself into something, with more discipline behind it. All right, he said finally. We look first. Tonight. Tomorrow, once we know exactly what we're dealing with, we decide how to stop it. Verity nodded once, something settling in her shoulders, that looked, to Cyrus's eye, almost like relief. They rode out an hour past dark, the 3 of them, the cold clear night pressing in close around them, breath and hoofbeats the only sound on a trail that wound up out of the valley floor toward the ridge Barnabas had described. Verity's ankle made the ride harder than she let on, Cyrus could tell, as much by the careful way she held herself in the saddle, but she said nothing of it, and he'd learned enough about her in 3 short days not to insult her by asking whether she needed to turn back. You're certain this ridge gives a clear view, Cyrus said, low, as they climbed. Certain as anything gets up here at night, Barnabas said. Used to run trap lines through this same country years back. Ground don't forget, even if a man's memory sometimes does. They came out above the Osgood place while later, the small homestead spread out below them in the moonlight, smoke curling thin from the chimney, and Cyrus felt his chest tighten at the sight of a second horse tied at the rail beside the Osgood's own too. A fine animal, clean-limbed, entirely out of place beside the working stock that belonged there. That's him, Barnabas murmured. Same kind of horse he had 4 years back. Man never could resist owning something finer than the company he kept. Through the small square of window lit warm and gold, from within they could see shapes moving. A man seated at the table, gesturing with the particular expansive confidence Cyrus remembered, from his own kitchen 2 winters back. Papers spread out in front of him. Old man Osgood leaning in close, nodding along, his wife standing near the stove, with her arms crossed in a posture that read, even from this distance, as uneasy. He's got the same papers, Cyrus said, quiet, his voice gone rough. Same kind of maps. I'd stake my life on it. Can't prove that from up here, Barnabas said. Not enough to put in front of a judge, even if this territory had one worth trusting. I don't need a judge yet. Cyrus's hands had curled into fists at his sides, without his quite noticing. I need to know how much time we've got, before he's got Osgood's signature same, as he once had mine. Verity, beside him, had gone very still, her eyes fixed on the lit window below. He's leaving something with them, she said. Look, he's not asking Osgood to sign tonight. He's leaving papers behind for them to look over. That means he means to come back. When? I don't know. But a man that careful doesn't rush the final signature. He'll want them sitting with hope a few days first, turning the numbers over in their own minds, until the wanting does half his convincing for him. She looked at Cyrus, something grim and knowing in her expression. That's how he did it to you too, isn't it? Gave you time to want it before he ever asked you to sign anything. Cyrus's jaw tightened, the memory rising up unwelcome. Near enough. They watched a while longer until the man in the fine coat rose from the table, shook hands warm and easy with Osgood, and rode off east into the dark, the sound of his horse's hooves fading slow into the night, and only then did the three of them turn back toward the ridge trail and begin their own quiet ride home. Nobody spoke much on the way back. The moon had climbed higher, throwing pale light across the snow, and Cyrus found his mind working through the shape of what came next with a clarity that felt, after 2 days of shock and storm and slow dawning understanding, almost like relief. "We warn the Osgoods," he said finally, breaking the silence, "before he comes back for that signature. Show them what he did to me. Give them the chance to see the truth of him before they hand over what little they've got left." "And after that?" Verity asked. "After that, I finish what I should have finished 2 winters back. I face him myself. With proof this time, instead of a stranger's smooth voice doing all my thinking for me." Cyrus's voice had gone steady, certain, in a way it hadn't been since the stagecoach door first opened 3 days before. "He took my trust once because I never once made him prove himself. That's not happening again. Not to me. Not to the Osgoods if I've got any say in it." Barnabas, riding a little ahead, glanced back over his shoulder. "And the wager, the horse." Cyrus looked toward Verity, riding steady beside him despite the ankle he knew was aching worse than she'd admit, and felt something settle warm and certain in his chest despite the cold night air. "The wager's not finished either," he said. "There's still Sundown to answer for, and a horse that's got more trust left to earn back before this is done. Both things matter. I don't aim to let one wait on the other." "Partnership," Verity said quietly, the word carrying easy on the cold night air. "That's what you called it back at the cabin. I meant to hold you to it. I intend to be held to it." He glanced at her, moonlight catching the set of her jaw, steady despite the long ride, and the aching ankle, and everything else the last 3 days had asked of her. "Whatever we find tomorrow, whatever it costs to face him, we face it together, not as a man protecting a woman too fragile for the truth of it." "Good," she said, "because I didn't cross 2,000 miles to be sheltered from the hard parts of a life I chose to share." He looked at her a long moment, the moon high and cold above them both, and felt something settle into place in his chest that had nothing to do with debts or wagers or a horse still learning to trust the world again. "Partnership," he said again, quieter this time. "All right." It was, he understood even as he said it, the truest word he'd spoken since she'd stepped off that stagecoach 3 days before, and it cost him considerably less to say than he'd have guessed, given everything that had come before it. They reached the cabin near midnight, the fire long since burned down to coals, and while Barnabas saw to the horses, Cyrus stood outside a long moment before going in, looking toward the dark shape of the mountains where, somewhere in that vast cold country, a man who'd once sat at his own kitchen table and smiled while he lied was riding home tonight satisfied, with an evening's work well done. 3 weeks until his own note came due, considerably less than that before another family lost everything to the same smooth voice and the same forged papers. He thought of Wraith standing quiet in the shelter for the first time in 2 years, and thought of the mark across that scarred eye, and felt something harden in his chest that wasn't quite anger anymore. Something steadier. Something that had a shape and a direction to it now instead of just a wound that never quite closed. He thought of Verity, inside, her ankle wrapped, her resolve entirely unshaken by 3 days, that would have sent most people twice her experience running for the nearest exit. Partnership, she'd called it. He turned the word over once more in the cold night air, watching his own breath cloud and disappear, and understood, standing there under a sky scrubbed clean by the storm, that whatever came next, whatever it cost him to walk toward Jasper Coyle, with proof in his hands instead of fury alone, he was not walking toward it the same man who'd stood at that stagecoach door 3 days ago. He went inside. The fire was low, the cabin quiet, and Verity was still awake by the hearth, waiting, and Cyrus Bramwell sat down across from her and began, for the first time since any of this had started, to actually plan. Not a wager this time, a reckoning. "We can't simply ride up and accuse him," Verity said, once Barnabas had come in, from settling the horses, and taken his own seat by the fire. A man that's smooth will deny it plain to our faces, and without something solid behind the accusation, will only have warned him we're coming. So we go to the Osgoods first, Cyrus said. Show them what he did to me. Let them hear it from a man who lived through the whole shape of the lie, before they sign anything they can't take back. That's a start. Verity considered it, turning the problem over the same careful way she'd turned over a frightened horse's fear. But telling isn't always believing, Cyrus. You know that better than most, given how little your own doubt believed my letter, until you'd watched the proof stand in front of you all afternoon. The Osgoods have already let that man into their kitchen 3 times. They've already started wanting what he's selling. Words alone may not undo that kind of wanting. Then what would? Bring Barnabas. Let him tell what he saw 4 years back, with his own eyes, the horse, the cruelty, the temper that don't wait to build slow. That's not second-hand talk of a bad investment. That's a plain account of a man's character, witnessed firsthand, from somebody with no reason to invent it. She glanced at Barnabas. Would you be willing? Already turning the words over in my head, Barnabas said. Been turning them over most of the ride home, truth told. Cyrus looked between the two of them, something loosening in his chest that had been wound tight since the moment Wendell had said the name Coyle out loud that morning. And after the Osgoods, what then? Then we make sure he knows we're not the only ones who've seen through him, Verity said. A man like that survives on being the only one in the room who knows the whole truth. Take that away from him, put witnesses in front of him, put proof in front of him, put people who've compared their stories and found them matching, and the smoothness stops working the way it's used to working. You make it sound simple. It isn't simple. It's only clear, which is a different thing entirely, and I'd rather walk toward something clear than something simple that turns out to be wrong. She held his gaze, steady, the firelight catching something resolute in her expression. You spent 2 years believing this land was the only thing left worth protecting, Cyrus. I'd ask you to widen that sum. The Osgoods deserve protecting too. So does whoever comes after them, if we let him walk away from this valley with his pockets fuller and his methods untouched. Cyrus sat with that a long moment, the fire popping low, and felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the particular clarity of finally understanding what this fight had actually always been about. Not just his own land, not just his own pride, wounded 2 winters back, and left to fester in silence ever since. All right, he said finally. We go to the Osgoods first. Tomorrow, first light. Then we decide the rest of it together once we know how they mean to receive it. Verity's ankle kept her from sleep while longer, propped on a folded blanket near the hearth, and Cyrus found himself sitting up, with her rather than heading up to the loft he'd have taken any other night, the two of them talking low, so as not to wake Barnabas, who'd claimed the far corner of the room, with the particular unbothered ease of a man who'd slept in considerably worse places over 11 years of ranch work. Can I ask you something? Cyrus said, echoing her own question back at her from earlier that evening. You may ask. Same conditions as before. Your father, the one who taught you all this. He nodded vaguely toward the window, toward the corral, where Wraith stood somewhere out in the dark. What was he like? Something softened in Verity's face, the guarded carefulness she carried most hours of the day easing into something younger, something closer to the girl she must have been, before Edgar and, before the letters, and before 2,000 miles of hard travel had taught her to keep most things close. Patient, she said. More patient than any man I've met since, if I'm honest, present company included, though you're coming along better than I expected. A small, dry smile. He used to say a horse's fear was never really about the horse, always about whatever hands had touched it before. He said the same was true of people, though it took me a good deal longer to understand what he meant by that. Do you understand it now? I'm beginning to. She looked at him, something steady and unguarded in the look that hadn't been there 3 days before. I understand, for instance, that a man who watched everything he trusted get taken from him by a smooth voice, and a false promise might spend along, while afterward flinching at anything smooth or promising, whether it deserved the flinch or not. Cyrus felt that land somewhere close to the center of his chest. Is that what I did to you? At the station. It's part of what you did, yes. Though I've come to understand it a good deal better than I did, that first afternoon watching what Coyle actually cost you, and what he's still trying to cost other people in this valley. She was quiet a moment. My father died before I ever got the chance to bring him a hard thing like this, and ask what he'd have done with it. I find myself imagining his answer more often than I'd have expected, these last few days. What do you imagine he'd say? That the horse doesn't need you to be fearless, only steady. There's a considerable difference. She looked toward the window herself now, toward the same dark shape of the corral he'd been looking at a moment before. I imagine he'd say the same about a man walking toward Jasper Coyle tomorrow, with proof in his hands instead of only fury. Steady beats fearless most days, in my experience. Fearless gets a person hurt. Steady gets the work done. Cyrus sat with that a long while, the fire burning low, and understood that whatever else the strange, hard week had cost him, it had also handed him something he hadn't known to go looking for. Somebody steady to walk beside, into whatever came next. First light found the three of them riding out along the valley road, breath fogging white in the cold, the Osgood homestead coming into view a little before mid-morning, a modest place, well kept despite hard years, smoke rising thin, from the chimney same as it had the night before. Ezra Osgood met them at the door himself, a broad, weathered man somewhere past 50, his wife Adeline a step behind him, with a dish towel still in her hands, and a wariness in her eyes, that told Cyrus plainly enough word of their arrival had already put her on some kind of guard. Bramwell! Osgood's greeting was cordial enough, though his eyes moved, from Cyrus to Verity to Barnabas, with a caution that hadn't been there in easier years. Don't recall the last time you rode all this way just for a visit. Not just a visit, Ezra. Wish it were. Cyrus dismounted, and something in his own bearing must have carried the weight of what he'd come to say, because Osgood's expression shifted, wariness deepening into something closer to alarm. Can we come in a spell? There's something you and Adeline need to hear, and I'd rather say it plain inside than shout it across your own yard. They sat at the Osgood's kitchen table, the same kind of table Cyrus had sat at 2 winters back, with Jasper Coyle's papers spread out in front of him, and the irony of it wasn't lost on him even as he began, haltingly at first, and then with growing steadiness, to tell the whole of his own story. The silver claim that didn't exist. The savings gutted inside a single season. The note that had nearly cost him his father's land, and the deadline now hanging over what remained of it. Adeline Osgood's hands had gone very still around her coffee cup by the time he finished. Same man, she said, quiet. Fine coat. Talks like he's already decided you're going to say yes, before you've had the chance to think it through proper. That's him. He's been out here 3 times now. Ezra's jaw had tightened, some private shame moving behind his eyes. Showed us papers, essay marks, told us he'd already put his own money into the claim, said he only needed a partner, with local standing to help move the operation along once the paperwork cleared. He looked at his wife, something apologetic in the look. I told Adeline we couldn't afford not to take the chance. Been 3 seasons behind on our own note. Man made it sound like the answer to every hard year we've had. That's exactly how he made it sound to me, Cyrus said. Word for word. Near enough. Barnabas leaned forward then and told his own piece of it. The horse camp, for years back, the court and the scar and the temper that arrived all at once with no warning at all. Adeline's face had gone pale by the time he finished, and Ezra sat very still, staring at the table, the particular stillness of a man watching a hope he'd been holding onto for weeks quietly come apart in front of him. We haven't signed yet, Ezra said finally, his voice rough. He's coming back end of the week. Said he'd have the final papers ready. Then you've still got time, Verity said, speaking for the first time, since they'd sat down, her voice steady and clear in a way that drew every eye in the room toward her. Time enough to ask him questions he won't have easy answers for. Ask to see the assay office's own records, not just his copies. Ask for the name of a single other investor he can point you toward who's actually seen returns. Ask him to wait a season before signing anything, and watch how quick a man in a hurry to close a deal finds reasons that particular request offends him. Adeline looked at her, something like gratitude moving behind the wariness. You sound like you've done this kind of asking before, Mrs. Bramwell. I've spent a good deal of my life watching people decide, too late, that a thing wasn't what it was promised to be. I'd rather help somebody ask the hard questions early than comfort them after the fact. Verity's voice had gone gentle now, though no less certain. You're not foolish for having believed him this far, Mrs. Osgood. He's practiced at exactly this. But you don't have to keep believing him now that you know what you know. Ezra Osgood sat, with that a long moment, and then reached across the table, and shook Cyrus's hand, hard and grateful, the kind of handshake that carried more in it than words alone could have managed. We're obliged to you, Bramwell. All three of you. He looked toward the window, toward the road east, where Coyle would eventually come riding back for his answer. What do you aim to do about him, once we've turned him away? I aim to make sure turning him away here isn't the end of it, Cyrus said, something hard and resolved settling into his voice. Man like that doesn't stop just because one family sees through him. He moves on to the next and the next after that unless somebody finally makes him answer for the whole trail of it. How do you mean to manage that? Cyrus looked toward Verity and toward Barnabas, and felt the shape of the answer settling into place even as he said it out loud for the first time. However it takes, he said, but not alone. Not this time. They rode back toward home in the early afternoon, the Osgood place shrinking behind them into the pale winter light, and Cyrus found his mind circling back again and again to the particular look on Ezra Osgood's face when Barnabas had described the scar. Recognition, shame, the specific, sinking understanding of a man realizing how close he'd come to losing everything to the same smooth voice that had already cost Cyrus so dearly. He thought of Wraith, waiting back in the shelter, and of the Sundown that had never quite finished arriving 3 days before. A wager interrupted by a storm, a trust still only half built, hour by patient hour, same as the trust now slowly building between himself and the woman riding steady beside him. He'll come back Friday, Verity said, breaking the quiet. For his answer. He will. And you mean to be there when he does. Cyrus looked at her, at the resolve steady in her face despite the long ride, and the aching ankle and 3 days that had asked more of her than most people managed to give in 3 years. I mean for both of us to be there, he said. Him and Wraith both got scarred by the same hand, same as you said yourself. Seems only right the reckoning happens with the two of us standing together when it does. Same partnership. Same patience. Whatever it costs to see it through. Verity said nothing to that, only nodded once, the particular quiet nod of a woman who'd already decided the answer, before he'd finished asking the question, and the three of them rode the rest of the way home beneath a sky scrubbed clean and hard and blue, carrying between them everything they now knew, and everything still left to prove, a debt not, yet settled, a horse not, yet fully gentled, and a Friday sundown bearing down on all of it at once, closer now than any of them had reason to feel entirely ready for. They reached the homestead a little past midday, and Verity, despite the ankle and the long ride, and the weight of everything the morning had asked of her, went straight to the corral rather than into the cabin, and Cyrus found himself following her without quite deciding to. Wraith came to the rail when she called him, not on a lead line, not haltered, simply came, the way a creature comes to somebody it has decided, in its own slow animal reckoning, to trust, and Cyrus stood at the fence, and watched his wife rest her forehead against the horse's scarred brow, both of them still a long moment in the pale afternoon light. He's further along than I expected, Cyrus said quietly, coming up beside her. Fear doesn't heal on anybody's particular schedule. Neither does trust. Verity ran a hand slow along Wraith's neck, and the gelding leaned into it unhurried, the way he'd been leaning, into her touch more, and more each day. But it does heal given enough patient hours. That's the whole of what I know for certain watching animals like him my whole life. Given enough patient hours, most wounds find their way toward closing. Even the 2-year kind. Even those. She glanced at him, something knowing in the look. Even the kind a man carries around, from a business partner who lied to him at his own kitchen table, if he's willing to let somebody help him carry it instead of holding the whole weight alone. Cyrus didn't have a ready answer for that and found, standing there in the cold afternoon light, with his hand resting near hers on the fence rail, that he didn't much mind not having one. "We never finished it," he said instead. "The wager. Storm cut it short, before you'd gotten him following free, off the line entirely." "No, we didn't." Something almost like a smile touched the corner of her mouth. "I don't consider that a loss, Mr. Bramwell. Only a pause. I intend to finish it properly, same as I intend to finish everything else we've started this week. Just not today. Today he's had enough asked of him already, same as the rest of us." They stood at the fence a while longer, not talking, the horses steady breathing, and the wind moving soft, through the pines the only sound in the whole wide winter valley, and Cyrus understood, watching her hand rest easy on the animal's neck, that some things in this life could not be rushed toward their finish no matter how badly a person wanted them settled, that the waiting itself was doing work he couldn't yet fully see the shape of. The day after brought more visitors than Cyrus had seen at his fence line in the whole of the previous year combined. Word of the Osgoods' near miss had traveled the way word always traveled in a valley, with few enough ranches, that everyone knew everyone's business, and by mid-morning 3 separate families had ridden out on invented errands, each one circling, with varying degrees of subtlety, toward the same question. Was it true? Was there truly a man moving through the territory selling worthless claims dressed up as fortune, and had he truly scarred a horse, and gutted a trapper's savings, and near cost the Osgoods everything besides? Cyrus answered each of them plain, without embellishment, because he'd learned by now that the plain truth carried more weight than anything dressed up to sound worse than it already was. Wendell lingered longest of anyone, and Cyrus noticed, part-way through the morning, that the young man's attention had drifted from the conversation at the fence toward the corral itself, where Verity had resumed her slow, patient work with Wraith despite the wrapped ankle still troubling her stride. "She's got him standing for a brush now," Wendell said, quiet, mostly to himself. "For days. Man tried 2 years and got nothing but broken bones for the effort." "You want to ask her something," Cyrus said. "Go ahead and ask. She don't bite, whatever Wraith's reputation might suggest about the company you're keeping out here." Wendell colored slightly, but crossed to the fence anyway, and waited until Verity glanced up from her work before he spoke. "How do you know," he asked, "when to push and when to wait? Seems like it'd all look the same to somebody who didn't know what they were watching for." Verity considered the question, with the same careful weight she gave most things, her hand still resting easy on Wraith's neck. "You watch the ears first, then the weight in the hindquarters. A horse tells you everything it's about to do, Mr. Pruitt, well before it does it, provided you're patient enough to learn the language instead of assuming you already speak it." She glanced at him, something almost approving in the look. Most men rush past that part. Assume the animal owes them cooperation simply because they've decided to ask for it. The ones who slow down enough to actually listen tend to get considerably further, considerably faster, than the ones who don't. Could you teach a fella that? The listening part? I could. Whether you've got the patience to learn it is a different question entirely, and one only you can answer given enough hours in a corral to test it. Something dry moved at the corner of her mouth. "You're welcome to ride out and find out once this business with Coyle is settled one way or another. I don't imagine either of us will have much appetite for teaching lessons before Friday's come and gone." Wendell nodded, something thoughtful settling over his usual restless energy, and Cyrus watched the exchange, with a quiet satisfaction he hadn't expected to feel, watching his wife hand a piece of her hard-won gift to a boy who'd ridden onto his land 3 days back mostly hungry for gossip, and was leaving now, it seemed, hungry for something considerably more worth having. Wendell rode out again that afternoon, this time with news that settled cold and certain into Cyrus's chest. "He's been asking after you?" Wendell said, dismounting quick, something urgent in his manner. "Coil asked a fella at the mercantile whether the Bramwell note was still good, whether you'd had any trouble making good on it. Fella didn't know enough to be suspicious, told him plain you were 3 weeks out, from the deadline same as everybody in the valley already knew." "He's watching," Cyrus said. "Seems that way. And there's more." Wendell hesitated, the particular reluctance of a young man about to hand over news he suspected wouldn't be welcome. "Heard he's moved his plans up. Asking around whether Friday still suits the Osgoods, on account of he means to be moving on from this territory inside the week regardless of how their business concludes." Barnabas, standing nearby, went very still. "Moving on. Meaning he don't intend to stay in this valley much past Friday, one way or the other. Whether the Osgoods sign or not." Wendell looked between the three of them. "If he's leaving regardless, seems to me Friday's the only chance anybody's going to get to make him answer for any of it. Miss it, and he's 2 territories gone before spring same as he was after Mr. Bramwell here." The words landed heavy in the cold afternoon air, and Cyrus felt the whole shape of the coming days sharpen into something with far less room to breathe than he'd allowed himself to believe. Friday. Not just the Osgoods' answer. Not just his own reckoning, long overdue. The only chance, likely, that this valley, or any other would get to see Jasper Coil finally made to stand still long enough for the truth to catch up with him. "Then Friday it is," Cyrus said, quiet and final. "Whatever it takes." Jasper Coil took his supper at the hotel in Sula that same evening, entirely unaware that the valley around him had spent the better part of 2 days quietly turning against everything he'd spent the last month building. He was, by every outward measure, a satisfied man. The fine coat hung pressed and clean on the back of his chair. The meal in front of him was the best the hotel kitchen had to offer, paid for, same as everything else this trip, out of the last territory's takings, and he ate it with the unhurried appetite of a man who had never once, in all his years of this particular trade, been made to answer for any of it. He had already decided, privately, that this would be his final week in the Bitterroot Valley. The Osgood signature would close out a tidy season's work, and the Bramwell note, bought quiet, filed under a name that led nowhere, set to mature in 3 weeks' time regardless of whether Bramwell himself ever learned, who truly held it, would settle itself without Coil needing to lift another finger. Some debts, he had learned, collected themselves eventually, given enough patience and enough distance between himself and the collecting. He thought briefly of the trapper, Bramwell, a stubborn, proud sort of man, the kind who took a loss harder than most, because he'd never expected to take one at all. Coil felt, if anything, a small measure of professional satisfaction recalling it. How easily the man's pride had done half the convincing for him, how little actual persuading it had taken once Bramwell decided, on his own, that the opportunity was too good to interrogate too closely. He did not think of the horse at all. Had not thought of it in years, in fact, the particular unpleasantness of that afternoon filed away, and forgotten the same way he filed away most things that no longer served any purpose remembering. He signaled for a second cup of coffee, and did not notice the 2 ranch hands at the far table, who fell silent the moment he glanced their way, nor the particular care with which the hotel's proprietor avoided meeting his eye when refilling his cup, nor any of the small, quiet signs that a valley he'd assumed entirely unsuspecting had, in fact, begun watching him considerably more closely than he had any reason to expect. Friday, he thought, finishing his meal. Friday, and then on to whatever territory came next. He had no notion, sipping his coffee in the warm lamplight of that hotel dining room, that Friday was going to look nothing at all like the tidy, quiet conclusion he had planned for it. Thursday evening came down slow and cold, the last full day before the reckoning, and Cyrus found himself standing at the corral fence long, after the light had failed, unable to settle into the stillness the cabin offered. Verity found him there. Didn't say anything at first, only came to stand beside him at the rail, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, through the cold, and for a long, while the 2 of them simply watched Wraith's dark shape move quiet through the shadowed pen. "You're frightened," she said eventually. "Not a question. Wouldn't you be? I would. I am, if I'm honest, though I've had considerably more practice than you at not letting it show plain on my face. She turned to look at him, moonlight catching the steady line of her jaw. What frightens you most? The confronting of him or something underneath that? Cyrus was quiet a long moment, turning the question, over the way he turned, over most hard things, slow and reluctant. Underneath, he admitted finally. I keep thinking about that afternoon at my own table, how easy he made it look, believing him, how easy I made it, letting him. His hands tightened on the fence rail. Man like that, he doesn't just take money. He takes something harder to get back afterward. I spent 2 years telling myself I'd never hand my trust to anybody again, without proof standing plain in front of me first. And here I am, 5 days married to a stranger, trusting her with more than I've trusted anybody since. He looked at her, something raw and unguarded in his face, that he hadn't let show since the stagecoach door first opened. What if I'm wrong too? What if Friday goes bad, and I've dragged you and Barnabas and the whole valley into a reckoning I had no business starting? Verity was quiet a moment, letting the words settle between them, before she answered. You're not wrong to trust me, she said finally. I know that the way I know most things worth knowing, not because I can prove it to you with papers or essay marks, but because I've shown you hour by hour, 5 days running, exactly who I am when nobody's forcing me to be anything else. She reached over and covered his hand, with hers on the fence rail, her palm rough with work same as his own. As for Friday, you're not dragging anybody anywhere they haven't chosen to walk themselves. Barnabas chose it the moment he told you what he saw 4 years back. I chose it the moment I asked to try that horse before you'd finished disappointing me at that stage station. The Osgoods chose it the moment they let us in their kitchen and told us the truth of what they'd nearly done. Her voice had gone steady, certain, the same voice she'd used all afternoon, with an animal twice her size, and considerably less trusting than he'd have believed possible 5 days before. You didn't start this reckoning, Cyrus. Coyle started it, 2 winters back, the day he decided your trust, and your savings, and this horse's whole gentle nature were all just things to be used up and discarded. You're only the one steady enough now to finish it. Cyrus turned his hand beneath hers, palm to palm, and something passed between them in the cold dark, that neither one of them rushed to name out loud. I never thought I'd be glad a letter disappointed me, he said quietly. Standing here now, I can't imagine wanting anything different than exactly how this turned out. Careful, Mr. Bramwell. Her voice had gone soft, though the familiar dry edge hadn't entirely left it. That's dangerously close to a kind word. Reckon it is. He looked at her a long moment, the moon bright and cold above them both, Wraith's quiet breathing the only other sound in the whole wide valley. Been a hard week to arrive at a kind word. Doesn't make it any less true saying it. Neither of them moved for a long moment after that, standing close at the fence rail, with their hands still joined, the whole weight of Friday still waiting out there in the dark for both of them, and Cyrus found that whatever fear he'd carried out to, that corral had not entirely left him. It had simply found something steadier to stand beside. They went in together not long after, Barnabas already settled by the banked fire, and the 3 of them sat while in a silence that had stopped, sometime over the last 3 strange and difficult days, being anything close to uncomfortable. Friday, Barnabas said eventually, into the quiet. Man's had 2 years thinking nobody in this territory would ever catch up to what he did. Gonna be a particular kind of satisfying watching his face when he understands he was wrong about that. Don't go looking for satisfaction in it, Verity said, though something almost like a smile touched her voice. Look for the truth instead. Satisfaction has a way of making a person careless right when carelessness costs the most. Wise woman, Barnabas said, glancing at Cyrus. You did all right for yourself ordering this one sight unseen. Didn't feel that way 5 days back, Cyrus said. Feels considerably different now. Verity said nothing to that, only looked at him with something warm and unguarded in her expression. And outside the wind moved soft, through the pines, and somewhere out in the dark corral a horse, that had spent 2 years distrusting the whole of the world, stood quiet under the same cold stars, waiting same as the rest of them for whatever Friday was going to bring. Friday arrived the way most reckonings do. Quiet at first. Ordinary, almost. The sun came up pale and gold over the eastern ridge, same as it did every other morning on that mountain. Birds working the treeline, same as always. The whole valley entirely unaware that today was the day 2 years of patient waiting finally came due. Cyrus woke before dawn. Except this morning felt different. Heavier. Because a man could tell himself all week he was ready for a reckoning. Could plan it out, careful and patient, same as Verity had taught him. And still wake on the actual morning of it, with his stomach knotted tight, as a green rope left out in the rain. He lay still a moment, listening to the cabin settle around him. Because that was the thing about fear. It didn't announce itself polite, waiting for a convenient hour. It arrived at dawn, same as everything else on this mountain, uninvited and entirely indifferent to whether a man felt ready for it. He ran the whole shape of the day through his mind piece by piece. Coyle could deny it all. Smooth as ever. Walk away clean, same as he'd walked away, from every mark before Cyrus. The land office paper could turn out thinner proof than Barnabas believed. The Osgoods could lose their nerve at the last moment, and sign anyway, desperate enough for easy money to overlook every warning already given them. And if none of that happened, if everything went exactly as planned, there was still the matter of a debt that wouldn't simply vanish because a con man got caught in a public square. 3 weeks had shrunk to considerably less than that now. Even a public reckoning wouldn't put coin back in a man's pocket by itself. He made himself stop, because spiraling never once solved anything. Hadn't solved anything 2 winters back. Sitting alone at this same table turning Coyle's betrayal, over and over till the turning itself became its own kind of wound. Wouldn't solve anything now either, however familiar the shape of it felt in the dark. Made himself breathe, slow and deliberate, the way he'd watched Verity breathe standing still in a corral, with an animal twice her size, and considerably less patient than she was. One thing at a time. That was what she'd have told him, if she'd been awake. Yet to hear the spiral his thoughts had already started climbing, before the sun had even cleared the ridge. He found her already up, dressed, hair pinned back plain and practical, her expression set, with a calm he'd come to understand, over these last 5 days, was not the absence of fear, but something considerably harder one than that. "You slept," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Some." She poured him coffee without being asked. The small domestic gesture landed between them, with more weight than either of them commented on. "Enough to be steady today. That's all I asked of the night. And if steady ain't enough, then we'll have learned that too and adjusted accordingly." She held his gaze a long moment, something unshakable underneath the calm surface of her eyes. "Steady's gotten a wounded horse to walk beside me unled, Cyrus. I've got no particular reason to distrust it now, in front of a man in a fine coat." Barnabas came in not long after, already dressed for riding, a folded paper tucked inside his coat, that Cyrus recognized as the land office confirmation they'd need, if words alone failed to move anybody. "Osgood sent word early," Barnabas said. "Coyle's expected by midday. Ezra means to stall him best he can till we arrive." "He'll manage it?" "Ezra's stubborner than he lets on. Man held off signing 3 separate visits already. One more morning won't break him." Cyrus looked out the window, toward the corral, where Wraith stood in the pale morning light, and felt the whole weight of the day ahead settle into his chest. Not as dread exactly, though there was plenty of that mixed in. Something steadier underneath it. Something that finally had a shape and a direction, after 2 years of carrying a wound that had never once been given the chance to close. "Then we ride within the hour," he said. Verity saddled her own horse in silence, checking the girth twice, though she knew perfectly well it was already secure, because her hands needed the occupation. Because if she let them go still, they'd start shaking, and she'd rather nobody see that particular truth this morning. Least of all a valley full of neighbors about to watch her stand beside her husband in the middle of a fight that had started long before either of them ever met. She thought of her father, wondered briefly what he'd have made of all this. The storm, the reckoning, a con man's cruelty reaching all the way back to a letter she'd written, with nothing but honest hope behind it. Would he have been proud? Or simply worried, watching his youngest daughter ride toward a confrontation 2,000 miles from the ranch that raised her? Proud, she decided. He'd have been proud. He'd always said the same patient hands that gentled a frightened horse could steady considerably harder things too, given the chance, and today was going to be the truest test of that belief she'd faced since leaving Ohio. She swung up into the saddle, steady despite everything still trembling underneath the steadiness, and found Cyrus watching her from across the yard with an expression she'd come to know well these last 5 days. "You're frightened," he said, echoing her own words back to him from 2 nights before. "Considerably." She didn't dress it up. "I find I don't much mind it, though. Fear rode alongside me plenty of times before I ever knew your name, Mr. Bramwell. I've gotten fairly practiced at making it sit quiet in the saddle behind me instead of taking the reins. Good a skill as any to have learned. The only one that's ever truly mattered in my experience." She nudged her horse forward, falling into step beside him. "Let's go finish what that man started 2 winters back, before either of us loses our nerve standing here talking about it instead." By the time Cyrus, Verity, and Barnabas reached the valley road, 3 other riders had already fallen in alongside them. Wendell first, then 2 of the neighboring hands who'd stood at Cyrus's fence 4 days earlier and watched a woman gentle a horse nobody else could touch. And by the time the Osgood homestead came into view, a small, quiet crowd had already gathered along the fence line, drawn by the same particular current of word of mouth that had once brought a dozen curious neighbors to watch Verity work with Wraith. Cyrus felt something tighten in his chest at the sight of them, because this was no longer just his fight, nor even the Osgoods. It had become, sometime over these last 5 strange days, the whole valley's business, and there was no undoing that now, even if some old, private part of him still flinched at being watched this closely. "Didn't figure on an audience," he said low to Verity as they dismounted. "Men like Coyle count on privacy, count on being able to talk a person around when there's nobody else in the room to catch the lie." She scanned the gathered faces, calm and assessing. "Take the privacy away from him, and you take away half his tools before he's even opened his mouth. And if he talks his way around this crowd same as he's talked his way around every crowd before it, then we'll have learned something true about him regardless, and lost nothing we hadn't already risked losing." She held his gaze a moment, steady. "You didn't trust me until you'd watched the proof stand plain in front of you. Give this crowd the same chance you gave yourself. Let them watch and decide for themselves what they're seeing." Ezra Osgood met them at the fence, his face drawn tight, with the particular strain of a man who'd spent the morning stalling a wolf at his own door. "He's not here yet. Should be along within the hour if he keeps to his usual habits." "Then we wait," Cyrus said. They did not wait long. Jasper Coyle rode into the Osgood yard a little before noon, dressed in the same fine coat Cyrus remembered from 2 winters back, his expression carrying the particular unhurried confidence of a man who had never once, in the whole course of his trade, ridden into a reckoning he hadn't already anticipated and outmaneuvered. He noticed the crowd before he noticed anything else, because that was always the first thing a man in his particular trade learned to notice. Numbers. How many witnesses? How many exits? How many friendly faces versus how many already wearing the particular closed expression of people who'd stopped believing him before he'd even opened his mouth. Cyrus watched something flicker behind the man's eyes. Not alarm exactly. Recalculation. The look of a card player counting a hand he hadn't expected to be dealt. Quite a gathering. Coyle dismounted easy, his voice carrying the same smooth, unhurried quality Cyrus remembered too well. Didn't realize the Osgood's business had grown into a valley-wide occasion. "It has now," Cyrus said, stepping forward, "because that was the whole point of standing here at all. Not to catch the man alone, where his smooth voice could work its usual patient magic on a single frightened family. To catch him in the open, where an entire valley's worth of eyes could watch exactly what he was, and decide for themselves whether they believed him. Coil's gaze settled on him. For just a moment, brief, almost too quick to catch. Something tightened behind the man's easy expression, before smoothing over again, into practiced calm. Bramwell. He said the name like an old acquaintance. Warm, unbothered. Been some while. Trust the ranch is treating you well. Trust is an interesting word for you to be reaching for. Something in Cyrus's voice carried enough weight that the easy smile on Coil's face flickered, just slightly, before steadying itself again. I don't believe I follow. I think you follow plenty well. Cyrus's voice had gone level, cold. Same as you followed 2 winters back, sitting at my own kitchen table, selling me a silver claim that never existed. Same as you've been following these last weeks, courting Ezra Osgood's confidence, with the exact same story, dressed up in a different valley's dirt. The crowd along the fence had gone very still, every eye fixed on the 2 men standing in the yard. Coil's gaze swept the gathered faces once, quick, calculating, before settling back on Cyrus, with a considerably cooler edge than it had carried a moment before. Serious accusation, Bramwell. Care to back it with something more than an old grudge? Happy to. Adeline Osgood, standing near the porch, with her arms crossed tight against the cold, spoke up before Coil could recover his footing. I'd like to hear it plain myself, Mr. Coil, seeing as you've sat at my own table 3 separate evenings, eating my own cooking, telling me things I'm only now beginning to understand I had no business believing. Something in her voice, quiet, wounded, but entirely unafraid, seemed to land harder on Coil than anything Cyrus had said yet. He glanced toward her, some flicker of genuine discomfort crossing his face, before the practiced smoothness reasserted itself. Adeline, I'd hoped we'd built something closer to trust than this. You hoped wrong, she said. Same as I did, hoping you were exactly what you claimed to be. Barnabas stepped forward first, the folded land office paper in his hand, and laid out, plain and unhurried, everything he'd pieced together. The transfer papers filed under a company name that led nowhere. The signature the land agent in Sula had recognized from 3 other fraudulent transfers across the territory. Coil listened with the particular stillness of a man weighing his options. When Barnabas finished, he offered a short, dismissive laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. A signature on a filed document. That's your proof? Any number of men might share a similar hand, Mr. Yount. I think a man your age would know better than to build an accusation on something so thin. Thin's one word for it. Barnabas didn't flinch. There's more if you'd care to hear the rest. I've heard plenty of accusations in my time. Rarely find them improve much with additional volume. Try me anyway, he told the second part then. The horse camp, 4 years back. The quirt and the scar, and the animal that had gone down on its knees under a stranger's cruelty. Coil's expression shifted at that, something harder to disguise moving behind his eyes, and Cyrus watched the crowd's attention sharpen further, several faces turning toward the corral fence where, unbeknownst to Coil, the very horse in question stood tied at a discreet distance, brought along at Verity's quiet insistence, that morning for exactly this purpose. I've owned a great many horses, over the years. Coil's voice had lost a measure of its earlier ease. Can't be expected to account for every animal that's passed through my hands, nor every accident that might have marked one along the way. Weren't no accident. Barnabas's voice went flat. I watched you do it. Watched your face while you did it, too. Wasn't a man losing his temper by mistake. Was a man who'd done it before and expected to do it again, without anybody troubling to remember his name for it. Bring the animal forward, Cyrus said. Wendell led Wraith into the yard, and the gelding came without resistance. Calm despite the crowd. Calm despite the stranger standing at the center of it. Until his gaze settled on Coil himself. Something in the horse's bearing changed all at once. Ears pinning flat, weight shifting back, tense, coiled, the same wariness Cyrus remembered from that very first morning at his own corral fence, except sharper now. More specific, aimed directly at the one man in the whole gathered crowd who had actually earned it. A ripple moved through the whole assembled yard, quiet at first, then louder, people leaning in, murmuring to their neighbors, several of the older ranch hands exchanging glances that plainly said they'd seen this particular kind of animal recognition before and knew exactly what it meant. A horse forgot plenty of things over the years, faces blurred, smells faded, but cruelty, delivered sharp enough and early enough, seemed to carve itself somewhere deeper than ordinary memory, someplace the years couldn't quite reach to soften it. A murmur moved through the onlookers. "Horse remembers you plain enough," Barnabas said, quiet into the sudden hush. 2 years he's carried that memory, longer than most men manage to hold a grudge, and for considerably better reason. Coyle's composure, for the first time since he'd ridden into that yard, showed a genuine crack. "This is theater," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. "A frightened animal reacting to a stranger proves nothing. Proves plenty to anybody standing close enough to watch it happen," Verity said, stepping forward for the first time, her voice carrying clear and steady across the yard. "I've spent my whole life reading what a horse's fear is trying to tell people who'll actually listen. This one's telling us something considerably more specific than mere strangeness, Mr. Coyle. I'd wager everybody here can see it plain as I can." Coyle's eyes moved to her then, and something in his expression shifted, calculation replacing the earlier dismissal. The particular look of a man searching for a new angle now that the old ones had stopped working. "You'd be the wife, I take it." His voice had gone smoother again, deliberately so, aimed now at the crowd rather than at Cyrus directly. "The one they're saying gentled this animal in an afternoon. Remarkable if true, though I'd wonder, standing here, whether a woman with such a gift for reading fear in an animal might occasionally mistake her own husband's grudge for something more substantial than it truly is. Grief has a way of finding villains where none exist, Mrs. Bramwell. I'd hate to see you led astray by a man's wounded pride." The comment landed with the particular cruelty of something aimed to divide rather than defend. Cyrus felt his jaw tighten, felt the old fury rise hot and immediate. Verity felt something rise in her too, though it took a different shape entirely than fury, because she recognized this particular tactic. Had lived it once already, standing in an Ohio corral, with dust on her dress, watching a man she'd once trusted decide, right there in front of witnesses, that her gift was something to be explained away rather than believed. Coyle wasn't inventing anything new. He was only reaching for the oldest tool in the whole tired kit. Tell a woman her own eyes and her own judgment can't be trusted, and half a crowd will nod along out of pure habit before they've even thought to question why. She would not give him that. Not today. Not after everything this week had cost her to finally stop shrinking for men who found her gift inconvenient. Before Cyrus could answer it, Verity's voice cut through the yard, level, unshaken. "I've spent considerably longer reading people than I have horses, Mr. Coyle, and I've found the two skills rely on much the same patience." Something cold moved beneath the calm surface of her voice now. "You're doing precisely what a man like you always does when the proof mounts against him. Reach for the nearest wedge and try to drive it between the people standing in your way. It didn't work on this horse. It won't work on this marriage either." A murmur moved through the crowd, something like approval, and Cyrus watched Coyle's practiced composure crack a fraction further, the smooth mask slipping just enough to show the calculation working underneath it. "Fine words," Coyle said. "Still nothing here a court would recognize as more than an angry neighborhood telling stories about a man they've decided to dislike." "Then let's give the court considerably more than stories," Cyrus said. He turned to Ezra Osgood. "Show him the papers he left with you 3 days back. Every page." Ezra produced the folded documents from inside his coat, and Verity took them, scanning quick but careful. "These assay marks. She held one page up toward the light. Same stamp as the ones you showed my husband 2 winters back, unless I'm mistaken. Same hand drew both, or I'll eat my own bonnet. She looked at Coyle directly. A genuine claim doesn't need the same forged seal copied twice across 2 different territories. Mr. Coyle, that's not evidence of a busy man reusing good stationery. That's evidence of a man who's never once filed an honest claim in his life. Coyle's jaw tightened. For the first time that morning, he had no ready answer to hand. Coyle's eyes moved across the gathered crowd once more. Cyrus watched him do the arithmetic. Watched the moment the man understood, fully and finally, that whatever smooth exit he'd counted on walking through this morning had already closed behind him. Even if every word of this were true, Coyle said, his voice going careful now, testing new ground. You've got no marshal out here to answer to, no court within 2 days' ride. Whatever you think you've proven today, gentlemen, it changes nothing about the note I hold on your land, Bramwell, nor the papers Osgood here is still entirely free to sign. I'm not signing anything, Ezra Osgood said, stepping forward, his voice rough but certain. Not today. Not any day after this one. Nor is the debt on my land quite so settled as you seem to believe, Cyrus said. A note obtained by a man who spent years running the same fraud across 3 territories is a note I intend to contest, with this land office confirmation and a dozen witnesses standing behind it. You may find courts more reachable than you'd like once word of this reaches Missoula proper. Something in Coyle's expression shifted then, not quite fear, but something adjacent to it, the particular unease of a man who had built his entire life around never being made to stand still long enough for consequence to catch up with him and was, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, discovering that it finally had. He reached for his saddlebag, some instinct toward flight overtaking the practiced calm. In his haste, a handful of papers spilled loose into the dirt. Wendell moved before anyone else, quick, dropping to gather them, before the wind could scatter what might be useful proof. Cyrus watched the young man's face go still, then pale, scanning one particular page longer than the rest. Mr. Bramwell. Wendell's voice had gone slow, careful. You'll want to see this. The paper was a draft, half-finished, in a hand Cyrus didn't recognize, though the words on it landed with a weight that made the ground beneath him feel suddenly less steady than it had a moment before. A letter, or the beginnings of one, crossed out and rewritten twice, addressed to a clerk at the Missoula stage office, instructing him, in language too careful to be anything but deliberate, to intercept and alter certain correspondence passing through his hands. Specifically, any letters bound for, or arriving from a Bramwell claim in the Bitterroot Valley, should such correspondence appear to involve matrimonial arrangements. Cyrus read it twice, before the meaning fully settled. He knew, Cyrus said, quiet, disbelieving. He knew I'd sent for a bride. Word travels in this territory same as anywhere else, Barnabas said grimly, reading over his shoulder. Man spent years making it his business to know things about the people he means to ruin. Verity had gone very still beside him. Cyrus turned to find her staring at the paper, with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Something between fury and a kind of grim, dawning understanding. He worried a strong partnership would save your land, she said slowly. Worried it enough to try and poison it before it ever had the chance to take root. She looked up at Coyle, something cold and unflinching in her gaze. You had somebody tamper with my letter, didn't you, before it ever reached him? Coyle said nothing, his jaw tight. The silence itself was answer enough. What did he change? Cyrus's question came out rougher than he intended, some old wound reopening even, as a new understanding closed over it. I don't know exactly. Verity's voice had gone tight, controlled, but I'd wager whatever line I wrote about capability, about partnership, about wanting a place where my gift would be welcomed rather than hidden, I'd wager that got trimmed down or dropped altogether, leaving behind only the plainest, starkest description of what I look like, stripped of every word, that might have prepared you to see past it. the particular controlled fury of someone doing arithmetic on an old hurt and finding it added up to something worse than she'd first assumed. He didn't just want your land, Cyrus. He wanted us broken before we'd even had the chance to begin. A man alone, humiliated, freshly heartbroken on top of an old betrayal. That's a man too distracted to fight back properly. When the note came due, Cyrus stood there a long moment, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. He felt something he hadn't expected to feel in the middle of this particular reckoning. Not just anger at Coyle, though that burned plenty hot. Grief, sharp and sudden. For the 3 days he and Verity had spent circling each other, with more caution than either of them had needed to carry. 3 days of hurt that had never belonged to either of them in the first place. Engineered from 2 territories away by a man who'd never once had to look either of them in the eye while he did it, because that was the particular cruelty buried inside it. Not just the money. Not just the land. Coyle had reached into a stranger's most private hope, the hope of finally being seen plain and whole by somebody willing to look, and twisted it, quiet and deliberate, into a weapon aimed at nobody's benefit but his own. Cyrus thought of that first morning at the stagecoach, the look on his own face, the particular shame of understanding, only now, how much of that moment had been built for him in advance by a hand he'd never even seen. Until he caught himself circling the thought too far. Until he understood that dwelling there, in the unfairness of it, would only hand Coyle one more thing he hadn't earned. Another hour of a good man's attention, spent circling backward instead of forward. That doesn't excuse the look on my face at that stagecoach, he said finally. Quiet, meant mostly for Verity. Whatever he trimmed from your letter, the choosing to believe the worst of what was left, that was still mine. It was, Verity agreed, just as quiet. But it matters, Cyrus. Knowing the ground was tilted before you ever took your first step onto it. It matters. Barnabas, still holding the draft, cleared his throat. There's a name here too, bottom of the page. Clerk he was writing to. He read it aloud, and Ezra Osgood, standing nearby, went pale. That's my late cousin's boy, Ezra said slowly. Works the stage office in Missoula. Families struggled since his father passed. Man like Coyle wouldn't have had to pay him much to look the other way on a piece of mail, not with a family that hard-pressed for coin. Everybody's got a price, in Coyle's arithmetic, Verity said, something bitter in her voice now. That's the whole of his trade, when you strip away the fine coat and the smooth talk, finding the exact place a person's heart is pressed, and pressing there. Cyrus folded the draft carefully, tucked it inside his own coat, alongside the land office papers. Evidence now of something considerably uglier than a bad investment. This goes to the judge in Missoula too, he said. Every bit of it. Whatever else happens today, I don't aim to let this particular piece of his cruelty go unanswered. Coyle, watching the exchange, made one last attempt at composure, straightening his coat with hands that weren't quite steady. None of this proves anything a court would recognize, he said. A draft letter, an angry horse, a trapper's grudge 2 years stale. I think twice, all of you, before staking your reputations on so little. You're welcome to think that, Ezra Osgood said, stepping forward, his own voice carrying a weight it hadn't held at the start of the morning. But you're not welcome on my land again. Not today. Not any day after. And I expect word of this morning's business to travel considerably faster, and considerably further than you're comfortable with, given how small this territory truly is once enough honest people start comparing what they know. The crowd along the fence murmured agreement. Low, solid. One by one, faces that had stood uncertain at the start of the morning now stood settled, decided, and Cyrus understood he was watching something considerably larger than a single reckoning finally take its full shape. A whole valley quietly deciding together that it would no longer be so easy a place for a man like Coyle to work. Cyrus watched something in Coyle's bearing finally, fully collapse. Not into confession exactly, the man was too practiced for that. But into a kind of cornered recalculation. the particular defeat of a con man who has run out of new territory to retreat into. This valley's finished with you? Cyrus said, stepping close enough now that his voice didn't need to carry beyond the two of them. Ride east, ride west, I don't much care which, but you'll find every homestead between here and Missoula's heard this story inside the week, and every one of them considerably less inclined to sit across a table from a stranger with a smooth voice and a fine coat than they were a month back. That's the cost of what you did here. Not just to me, to every family you'd have gotten to next. Coyle looked at him a long moment, and for just a heartbeat, something almost genuine flickered behind his practiced composure. Not remorse, Cyrus would think later, turning it over. Something closer to the particular hollow surprise of a man realizing, perhaps for the first time in his whole careful career, that the trade he'd built his life on had finally run out of new ground to stand on. You're a stubborn man, Bramwell? Coyle said, gathering his reins. Always were. I'd hoped that particular quality might work in my favor, that first afternoon at your table. Turns out it was the very thing that undid me. Reckon that's the first honest thing you've said all morning. Coyle offered no answer to that, only a short, humorless nod, and then, without another word, mounted his horse and rode out of the yard east, toward whatever territory still hadn't heard his name yet. Nobody moved to stop him. Nobody needed to. The reckoning, Cyrus understood, watching the man's fine coat disappear down the valley road, had never truly required a rope or a gun. Only enough honest people standing together, refusing any longer to hand him the one thing his whole trade depended on. Their silence. The crowd along the fence broke apart slow, in twos and threes, the particular loose energy of people who just watched something long feared finally come to nothing. Adeline Osgood came to Verity first, her eyes still bright, and took both her hands, without quite seeming to know what else to do, with the gratitude sitting so plain on her face. I don't know how to thank you properly, Adeline said. Any of you, but you especially, Mrs. Bramwell. Watching you stand up to him the way you did. I don't believe I'd have found the nerve myself. Not after 3 evenings of believing every word out of his mouth. You found the nerve the moment you let us in your kitchen and told us the truth of it, Verity said. That's the harder part, Mrs. Osgood. Admitting a mistake before it's finished costing you everything. Standing up to him after that was simply the easier half of the work. One of the neighboring hands, a quiet older man named Tolliver, who Cyrus barely knew beyond a nod at the mercantile, came up and shook his hand without much ceremony. Nearly signed with him myself 2 months back. Different claim, same story near enough. Talked myself out of it at the last hour, though I couldn't have told you rightly why. He glanced toward the road, where Coyle had disappeared. Reckon I know why now. Cyrus nodded, something settling warm and unexpected in his chest at the particular weight of that admission, how far the single man's cruelty had actually reached, how many quiet decisions across how many kitchen tables had turned, in the end, on nothing more than one family's willingness to finally say the truth of it out loud, where others could hear. Ezra Osgood caught Cyrus's arm, before they mounted up, something urgent still working behind his eyes. Your note, Ezra said. You said you meant to contest it. But that takes time, Bramwell, and time's exactly what you're shortest on. 3 weeks, wasn't it? Less than that now. Judge in Missoula's a fair man, from what I hear, but fair don't mean fast. Ezra glanced around at the small crowd still lingering near the fence, and something decided itself behind his weathered face. This valley owes you a debt today, whether you asked for the owing or not. Man tried to swindle every family standing here sooner or later, if you hadn't stopped him first. Seems only right the valley helps carry what's left of your own note, while the courts sort out the rest of it proper. Cyrus opened his mouth to refuse, old pride rising up out of habit. He caught himself before the words came out, looked instead at Verity, who was watching him with an expression that plainly expected him to remember, this time, the lesson they'd both spent the last week learning. I'd be obliged, Cyrus said instead, the words costing him considerably less than he'd have guessed a week before. More obliged than I know how to say plain. By the time they rode out of the Osgood yard, that afternoon, for other families had pledged what they could toward bridging the gap until the fraudulent note could be formally voided. Not charity, Ezra was careful to say, but investment in a neighbor who just saved the whole valley considerably more than any of them had lost individually. Cyrus rode home, turning the strange, warm weight of that over in his chest, understanding for the first time in 2 years that a debt didn't have to be carried alone to be carried honorably. Nobody spoke much on the ride back. The events of the morning still settling into whatever shape they were eventually going to take, hour by quiet hour, same as everything else that hard week had asked of them. Barnabas rode a little ahead, quieter than usual himself, and Cyrus understood, without needing to ask, that the old trapper was turning his own particular reckoning over. For years carrying a memory of cruelty he'd never expected to matter to anybody, only to watch it become, in the end, the single piece of proof that mattered most. Some weights, Cyrus was learning, only revealed their true purpose along, while after a man first started carrying them. Cyrus found his own mind circling back, again and again, to the particular look on Ezra Osgood's face, when Barnabas had described the scar. Recognition, shame, the specific, sinking understanding of a man realizing how close he'd come to losing everything to the same smooth voice that had already cost Cyrus so dearly. He thought of the letter, of a clerk in Missoula paid to trim away exactly the words that might have prepared him to see past a first look he'd had no business trusting so completely. He thought, too, of Wraith standing quiet in the corral at home, waiting on a sundown that had never quite finished arriving 5 days back. A wager interrupted by a storm, a trust still only half built, hour by patient hour, same as the trust that had been slowly, steadily building between himself and the woman riding beside him this whole strange week. "We never finished it," he said, breaking the quiet. "The wager." Verity glanced at him, something warm moving into her voice for the first time since the paper had spilled loose from Coyle's saddlebag that morning. "No," she agreed. "We didn't. Reckon it's past time we did." They reached the homestead a little before the light began its long slide toward evening. Verity went straight to the corral, same as she had, that very first afternoon, 5 days and a lifetime of understanding ago. Wraith came to the gate, before she'd even called him. Ears forward. Calm in a way Cyrus still found himself marveling at every time he saw it fresh. The scar over his eye had not faded, would never fully fade, Cyrus understood, same as certain wounds a person carried didn't fade, so much as simply stop being the first thing anybody noticed about them. But the wariness that had once lived permanently in the set of the animal's shoulders had gone, replaced by something steadier, something that looked, to Cyrus's eye, considerably like trust. Word had spread fast enough that a small crowd gathered again at the fence. Barnabas, Wendell, 3 of the same neighboring hands who'd stood witness that first patient afternoon. Drawn back now by the same current of curiosity that had carried them out here 5 days before, except considerably more invested in the outcome this time, having watched the whole valley's fortunes turn on the same patient hours that had first tamed this particular horse. The light had begun its slow, gold slide across the valley floor, catching the frost on the fence rails, catching the pale steam of the horse's breath, catching, too, the particular stillness that settled over a crowd waiting to see how a long story finally ends. Verity removed the lead line entirely, walked slowly toward the center of the corral, stopped, waited, the same patient stillness she had opened this whole strange, hard week with, 5 long days ago, standing at a gate, with a canvas bag over one shoulder and nothing but time and steadiness to offer a frightened animal. Wraith stood at the fence line a long moment, riderless, unled, entirely free to walk away from the woman who had spent 5 days earning every ounce of his trust one careful hour at a time, through a storm that had very nearly cost her considerably more than a few bruises. The crowd at the fence went quiet, watching to see which way 2 years of fear would finally break. Because that was the whole of what this moment had always been asking. Not whether a horse could be forced into obedience. Any of the 4 men before her could have managed that, given rope enough and cruelty enough to match it. The question had only ever been whether trust, freely given, could survive the one test that mattered. Whether the animal, given every reason and every excuse to run, would choose instead to stay. The gelding walked forward, slow, unhurried, and stopped beside Verity's shoulder, exactly where he'd walked all week on the lead line, except now there was no line at all. Only a horse who had decided of his own accord that this particular person was worth staying close to. Cyrus felt something crack open in his chest, watching it, because he understood, standing there at that fence rail, that he was watching considerably more than a wager finally settled. He was watching the exact shape of everything this strange week had tried to teach him. That trust, freely given and freely returned, looked nothing at all like the smooth, easy promises Coyle had built his whole cruel trade on. It looked like this instead, slow, unhurried, earned one patient hour at a time with nothing forced and nothing rushed and nothing demanded that hadn't first been given room enough to arrive on its own. The fence line broke into quiet, genuine applause, and Cyrus, standing among them, found that his throat had gone tight in a way he hadn't fully expected. Watching his wife stand in the gold evening light beside a horse that 2 years of cruelty and 4 grown men's failed efforts had never once managed to reach. Verity walked Wraith in one final slow circle, unled, and brought him back to the gate, where Cyrus stood. Something in her face carried the same quiet, unguarded warmth he'd seen there once before, 5 days ago, in the last light of that very first afternoon. "I believe that settles the wager, Mr. Bramwell," she said. "Though I confess I was never truly racing the Sundown. Not that first day, and certainly not today. I was only ever waiting for him to decide I was worth trusting." "Same as I imagine you've been waiting on me," Cyrus said quietly. "Since you stepped off that wagon and watched my face do something it had no business doing. Since before that, if I'm honest. Since the first letter I ever wrote you, wondering whether the words I put down plain and true would find a man willing to believe them, without needing every last one of them proven first." Cyrus looked at his wife, and at the horse standing calm and unrestrained beside her, and understood that the moment had finally arrived for the thing he'd been carrying since that very first morning. Unspoken, waiting for the right ground to say it on. His throat went tight before he'd even started, because 5 days of proof stood right there in front of him, plain as the horse itself, and still some old stubborn corner of his pride wanted to find a quieter way to say what needed saying. Wanted to slip the words in private, later, where nobody else could hear a proud man admit he'd been wrong. He looked at the small crowd still lingering near the fence. Looked at Barnabas, at Wendell, at the gold light settling soft across a valley that had watched every hard thing this week had asked of him, and understood that quiet wouldn't do. Not for this. Some debts needed paying where witnesses could see the paying of them, or they didn't properly count as paid at all. "I owe you an apology," he said, loud enough now that the small gathered crowd could hear it plain, because some debts, he'd come to understand this week, needed paying in front of witnesses to mean anything at all. Not just for the look on my face at that stagecoach door, though that's owed plenty on its own. I doubted the whole of you before I'd given you a single hour to prove otherwise. I let 2 years of somebody else's cruelty teach me to doubt the wrong person entirely, and I very nearly cost myself the finest thing that's happened to me in longer than I care to admit, over nothing more than a first look I had no right to trust, over 5 days of proof standing plain in front of me." Verity's eyes had gone bright, though her voice, when she answered, stayed steady. "I accept the apology," she said, "though I'd point out, Mr. Bramwell, that you've been proving yourself worth trusting back considerably faster than most men manage. That counts for something too." "Reckon it does." He looked at her a long moment, the gold evening light settling soft across the whole valley, the horse between them standing calm, as anything Cyrus had ever seen on that mountain. "I intend to spend a good deal longer than 1 week proving I understood exactly what I nearly let slip through my own careless doubt." Barnabas, watching from the fence, said something to Wendell that made the young man laugh low and easy, and the small crowd began to disperse into the gathering dusk, leaving Cyrus and Verity standing together at the corral gate in the last warm light of a day that had cost them considerably more than either had expected, and handed back in return, something neither of them had quite dared to hope for at its start. Barnabas stayed on for supper that evening on Verity's insistence, and Wendell too, once he'd finished seeing to the horses, and the small cabin filled with a warmth Cyrus hadn't heard inside its walls since long before his father died. "Never seen a man's face go through so many colors in one morning," Barnabas said, working through a second helping, with the particular appetite of a man who'd earned it. "Coil, I mean, watched him go smooth to rattled to downright pale all inside of 20 minutes. Wasn't half so satisfying as watching you produce that memory of the horse camp," Cyrus said. Man didn't have an answer ready for that one at all. 11 years foreman on outfits up and down this valley. Barnabas's tone went mock solemn. "Man learns to remember things. Comes in useful time to time. Comes in useful considerably more than time to time, the way this week's gone," Verity said, something warm and teasing in her voice now, that the whole hard business had finally lifted off her shoulders. "I begin to suspect, Mr. Yount, that you've been quietly running this entire homestead for the better part of 6 years, and simply letting my husband believe otherwise for the sake of his pride." Barnabas laughed, delighted, and even Cyrus found himself laughing along despite the mock target of the joke. The sound of it strange, and good in a cabin, that had carried more worry than laughter these last 2 years. Wendell, quieter than usual, finally spoke up, from his end of the table. "Can I ask something? Might be forward." "Ask it," Verity said. "That letter, the one Coil's clerk tampered with." He glanced at Cyrus, careful. "You ever wonder what it said before he got to it? The parts that got cut?" The table went quiet a moment. Cyrus looked at Verity, who considered the question with the same careful weight she gave most things. "I've wondered," she admitted, "though I've come to think it matters less than I once believed it might. Whatever words got trimmed away, the ones that survived were still true, still mine. A man determined enough to doubt them would have found a way to doubt the whole regardless, tampered or not." She reached over and rested her hand briefly on Cyrus's arm. The proof was always going to have to come from somewhere other than paper in the end. That's the whole lesson this week's tried to teach every one of us, one way or another. Wendell nodded slowly, filing the answer away the same careful way he'd been filing away everything else Verity had taught him these last 5 days, and the supper carried on late into the evening. Warm, unhurried, the first truly easy evening the cabin had held in longer than Cyrus cared to count. Barnabas raised his cup near the end of it, something almost sentimental working past his usual dry composure. "To patient hours," he said, "however many of 'em it takes." "To patient hours," Verity echoed, and Cyrus, raising his own cup to meet hers across the table, understood that whatever else this week had cost him, it had also handed him a toast he intended to remember for a good deal longer than one supper. The formal proceedings took until spring to settle proper, same as most legal matters did in a territory this far from anything resembling a courthouse worth the name. Cyrus rode to Missoula twice, that winter, papers in hand, Barnabas's sworn testimony, and the land office confirmation, and the draft letter all laid out before a judge, who listened with the particular patient attention of a man who'd heard his share of territorial swindles, but rarely one quite so thoroughly documented. The note was voided in March, the fraudulent transfer struck from record, and the land, that had once nearly slipped through Cyrus's fingers, over a stranger's smooth voice settled, finally and fully, back into his own name. He rode home from that second trip with the papers folded careful in his coat, same pocket that had once carried Coil's forged assay marks, and felt something ease in his chest that had been wound tight for 2 full years. Verity met him at the fence, when he rode in, reading the whole outcome plain off his face, before he'd said a single word. "Settled," she said. "Not quite a question." "Settled," he confirmed. "Land's ours, clean and clear. Judge said as much himself, plain as anything." She didn't say anything to that at first, only crossed the yard and put her arms around him, right there in the cold March mud, and Cyrus held her a long moment, feeling the particular weight of 2 hard years finally fully lift off his shoulders. "For days," she said eventually, into his shoulder. I keep thinking about that. For patient days is all it took, in the end, to undo 2 years of a man's cruelty. Hardly seems a fair trade weighed out that way. Weren't just 4 days, Cyrus said. Was every hour of patience you'd spent your whole life building toward, long before you ever wrote me that first letter. Man doesn't learn to stand still in a corral with a frightened horse in 4 days, Verity. Takes a lifetime of practice to make 4 days look that easy. She pulled back enough to look at him, something warm and startled crossing her face, and Cyrus understood he'd finally said something true enough to surprise even a woman who'd spent this whole hard week teaching him exactly that kind of truth. 20 years passed the way most years pass on that mountain. Slow in the living of them, gone all at once in the looking back. Cyrus Bramwell, 51 years old now, silver threading through hair that had once been dark as the coat on a certain scarred gelding, still ran the same land his father had proved up. Though it bore little resemblance now to the struggling claim he'd nearly lost to a smooth-voiced stranger 2 decades before. The debt had been settled that same spring, the fraudulent note voided by a Missoula judge presented, with enough sworn testimony and land office proof to make short work of it, and what had once been a single hard-pressed homestead had grown, slow and steady, into one of the most respected outfits in the whole Bitterroot Valley. Verity Bramwell had gentled a great many more difficult horses in the years since Wraith. Her reputation traveling considerably further than the valley, that had first doubted her, ranches sending for her, from 2 territories, over whenever their own hands failed, with an animal nobody else could reach. Cyrus never once resented the demands on her time the way he understood now a lesser man might have. He rode along himself, often as not simply to watch her work, understanding by then exactly what it had taken to earn a gift like that, and exactly what it had nearly cost him to dismiss it unseen at a stagecoach door 20 years before. Wraith himself had lived on for many good years after, ridden gently and often by Verity, and occasionally, once enough trust had accumulated between man and animal both by Cyrus, who liked to say he trusted no other horse on the property quite so completely, having watched with his own eyes exactly what it had taken to earn that particular animal's confidence. There had been harder years too, scattered through those 2 decades, same as any life carries. A drought that nearly broke 3 seasons running. A winter so cold they'd lost stock they could ill afford to lose. The fever came the 9th year. Verity took to bed in the height of summer, burning hot enough that Cyrus sat up 3 straight nights pressing cool cloths to her forehead, and trying, with a desperation he'd never once let himself feel even in the worst of that first hard week, not to imagine the shape of a life without her in it. He remembered sitting beside that bed on the 3rd night, her breathing shallow and ragged, and thinking of Wraith. Of the particular stillness she'd taught him to hold in a corral full of fear. Easy, easy now, easy. He'd said the words to her same, as he'd once said them to a wild horse rearing above his head in a storm, low and steady, not because he believed they carried any particular medicine in them, but because saying nothing at all felt considerably more dangerous than saying anything at all. She broke the fever on the 4th morning, weak but lucid, and the first thing she'd said to him, hoarse and half-laughing despite everything, was that she'd heard him talking to her the whole 3 nights like she was a spooked animal he was trying to gentle back from the edge of a corral fence. Wasn't far wrong, was I? He'd said. No, she'd admitted. Wasn't far wrong at all. They had carried each of those years the same way they'd carried that first hard week together. Patient and steady, hour by hour. And Cyrus had come to understand that this, the carrying together, not the absence of hardship, was the whole of what the word partnership had actually meant, all along, back when he'd first said it to her at a fence rail, with more hope in his chest than certainty. Jasper Coyle's name had surfaced twice more, over the years, each time from a different territory, each time with a different alias, each time eventually caught up to by the same patient network of land offices and honest neighbors comparing notes that Barnabas had first set in motion that long ago Friday. Cyrus never learned exactly how the man's story ended, only that it had, eventually, the way most such stories did once enough people stopped being willing to hand a con man their silence. Barnabas Yount had stayed on, as something considerably more than a hired hand across those 20 years, though neither man had ever quite settled on the right word for what he'd actually become to the Bramwell household. Foreman, some called him. Others simply said family, and let the word sit there without further explanation, because further explanation had never much been needed by anybody who'd watched the three of them, Cyrus, Verity, and Barnabas, work that land together season after season. He'd slowed some in recent years, the particular slowing of a man well past 70 who'd earned every gray hair honestly, out on horseback in weather that would have sent a younger man indoors. But he still rode out most mornings, still had opinions about the fence lines and the stock, and the particular way Cyrus insisted on running the north pasture, and Cyrus had come to understand, watching the old trapper move slower, but no less certain through each new season, that some men simply didn't retire from the things that had given their life its shape. They only learned to do those things a little more patiently, same as everything else worth doing right. Man taught me more about standing firm than my own father ever did, Cyrus told Verity once, watching Barnabas from the porch, working cattle with the same unhurried competence he'd brought to that very first reckoning with Coil. Don't imagine I'd have had the nerve for any of it, that whole hard week, without him standing at my shoulder the entire time. I imagine you'd have found the nerve regardless, Verity said, though I won't argue it came easier having him there. A young woman named Della Ashcroft had ridden out from the Osgood place that same autumn, newly arrived from back east, and quietly stubborn, asking whether Verity might take her on to learn the gentling trade proper. Cyrus remembered watching the two of them in the corral that first afternoon. Della's shoulders squared against some old family doubt about whether a woman belonged doing that kind of work at all. And remembered Verity's answer to her nervous first question, the very same answer, near enough word for word, that Verity had once given a doubtful young man leaning against that same fence rail 20 years before. You watch the ears first, Verity had said. Then you decide whether the rest of the world's opinion on what you're capable of matters more than what your own two hands can prove, given enough patient hours to prove it. Della had gone on, within a few years, to run her own outfit 2 counties over, gentling animals nobody else in that territory would touch, and Cyrus liked to think some small, unbroken thread ran clean, from that very first patient afternoon in his own corral all the way down, through every difficult creature, horse or person both, that Verity's gift had since reached and steadied. There had been, too, a small and private joke the two of them had carried across every one of those 20 years, resurrected every so often on quiet evenings, when the work was done, and the light was going gold across the valley same as it had that very first sundown. I could still best you at a wager, Cyrus told her once, well into their 10th year, watching her work a particularly stubborn colt that had taken her the better part of a week to gentle. Given the right conditions. Could you? Verity didn't look up from the colt, though something dry and amused had crept into her voice. Name the wager, Mr. Bramwell, and I'll consider whether it's worth my trouble to win it. Whoever gets that colt saddled first. You or me. You'd lose that wager considerably faster than you lost the last one. Reckon I would. He'd grinned at her across the corral, easy and unguarded in a way the man who'd once stood cold and doubtful at a stagecoach door would hardly have recognized in himself. Some wagers ain't about winning, though. Some of 'em you make just for the pleasure of losing to the right person. She'd laughed at that, a full, unguarded laugh, rare enough over the years, that Cyrus had learned to treasure each one, and told him he was getting soft in his old age, and he'd told her he'd gotten soft the exact moment a wild horse taught him what soft was actually worth, and neither of them had disagreed with the other for the rest of that particular evening. Wendell Pruitt, 39 now, and running his own outfit 2 ranches over, rode out one autumn evening the way he still did every few weeks, more out of old habit and old friendship than any particular errand, and found Cyrus at the same corral fence, where so much of that long-ago week had unfolded. Heard you telling that story again, Wendell said, dismounting. The bride and the horse, and the whole reckoning with Coil. Fella at the mercantile was asking after it, said his grandmother used to tell it different, said the horse threw her clean off, before she ever got him gentled. Cyrus laughed, short and warm. Stories grow their own legs, given enough years to walk on. Truth of it was considerably slower, and considerably less dramatic than most folks prefer telling it. Slower how? Cyrus looked out at the corral, empty now in the evening light, remembering. For days of patient hours, before that horse ever let her close enough to touch him proper. A whole week, before the debt was settled, and Coil finally ran clean out of territory willing to hide him. Wasn't one grand afternoon, Wendell, whatever the story's worn itself down to telling. It was a great many small, hard, patient hours, stacked up one on top of the last, until there was finally enough of them to stand on. Wendell considered that, leaning against the same fence rail he'd leaned against as a restless young man, hungry mostly for gossip back then, and Cyrus watched something thoughtful settle over the younger man's face, the same thoughtful look he'd worn, that very first week. The afternoon Verity had told him a horse would teach him everything he needed to know about listening, provided he had the patience for it. "You ever regret it?" Wendell asked. "The look on your face that first day. Way I hear it told, you nearly lost the best thing that ever happened to you over one bad moment at a stagecoach door." "Regretted it plenty those first few days," Cyrus said. "Don't regret it now, though. Not the moment itself. It taught me something I don't imagine I'd have learned any gentler way." He looked toward the cabin, where lamplight had just come up warm in the window, Verity's shape moving unhurried behind the glass. "Taught me that a man's first look at somebody is rarely worth trusting near, as much as his pride wants it to be. Taught me the proof's always worth waiting for, whether it's a horse or a debt, or a person standing in front of you, worth considerably more than they first appear. That the lesson you'd give a young fella starting out," Wendell asked, "if he asked you plain. You asking for yourself or for that girl I hear you've been courting down at the Osgood place?" Wendell colored slightly, caught out, and Cyrus laughed, low and warm, the particular laugh of a man who remembered plenty well what it felt like to be 19, and transparent about exactly this kind of thing. "Might be a little of both," Wendell admitted. "Then listen close, because I don't imagine I'll say it plainer than this." Cyrus considered the question a long moment, watching the last light fail soft and gold across the whole wide valley his father had first claimed, and he himself had very nearly lost, saved in the end not by fury or force but by patience and proof, and a woman who'd refused to let herself be judged smaller than she truly was. "I'd tell him this," Cyrus said finally. "Don't hand your trust out cheap, same as I learned the hard way not to. But don't you dare let an old wound teach you to doubt the wrong person either, just because doubting feels safer than hoping does. The two lessons look near enough alike from a distance that a man can lose years mixing them up, same as I very nearly did." He clapped a hand on Wendell's shoulder, steady, warm, the same steadiness he'd spent 20 years learning, from a woman who'd taught a wild horse to trust her one patient hour at a time. "Wait for the proof, son. It's always slower coming than a person wants. But it's worth considerably more, once it finally arrives, than anything a smooth voice ever promised you for free." Wendell nodded slowly, the words settling into him the same careful way most hard-won truths eventually settle, into a person willing to actually listen for them, and mounted up not long after, riding off toward whatever conversation waited for him at the Osgood place, considerably better armed for it than he'd been an hour before. Cyrus stayed at the fence while longer by himself, watching the last color drain slow out of the western sky. He thought of Wraith, gone 11 years now, buried on a low rise above the north pasture, where Verity still rode out some mornings to sit while in the quiet. He thought of Barnabas, older now but no less steady, still out working the north fence line most days despite every argument Cyrus had ever made for him to slow down. He thought of the letter that had started it all, tampered and cruel, and somehow, in the end, powerless against two people who'd simply decided to keep proving themselves true to each other regardless of how the ground had first been tilted beneath them. The cabin door opened behind him, warm light spilling out across the yard, and Verity's voice carried soft across the evening air. "Supper's ready, Mr. Bramwell. Whenever you're finished courting the sunset out there." "Coming," he called back, and found himself smiling, the particular easy smile of a man who'd spent 20 years learning that the finest thing a person could do, with a hard-won trust, was simply keep choosing it, evening after ordinary evening, for as long as he was given the years to choose it in. He crossed the yard toward the light, toward her. It had taken a wild horse, a cruel man's reckoning, and one very long afternoon to teach Cyrus Bramwell that lesson properly. He had spent every year, since considerably grateful he'd finally learned it.